Chapter 28 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28 The Height of Knowledge, 1902. America has always taken tragedy lightly. Too busy to stop the activity of their 20-million horsepower society, Americans ignore tragic motives that would have overshadowed the Middle Ages, and the world learns to regard assassination as a form of hysteria, and death as neurosis, to be treated by a rest cure. 3 hideous political murders that would have fattened the Eumenides with horror have thrown scarcely a shadow on the White House. The year 1901 was a year of tragedy that seemed to Hay to center on himself. First came, in summer, the accidental death of his son, Del Hay. Close on the tragedy of his son followed that of his chief, all the more hideous that we were so sure of his recovery. The world turned suddenly into a graveyard. I have acquired the funeral habit. Nicolay is dying. I went to see him yesterday, and he did not know me. Among the letters of condolence showered upon him was one from Clarence King at Pasadena, heart-breaking in grace and tenderness, the old King manner, and King himself simply waiting till nature and the foe have done their struggle. The tragedy of King impressed him intensely. There you have it in the face, he said, the best and brightest man of his generation, with talents immeasurably beyond any of his contemporaries, with industry that has often sickened me to witness it, with everything in his favor but blind luck, hounded by disaster from his cradle, with none of the joy of life to which he was entitled, dying at last, with nameless suffering, alone and uncared for, in a California tavern. Ça vous amuse, la vie. The first summons that met Adams, before he had even landed on the pier at New York, December 29th, was to Clarence King's funeral, and from the funeral service he had no gayer road to travel than that which led to Washington, where a revolution had occurred that must in any case have made the men of his age instantly old, but which, besides hurrying to the front of the generation that till then he had regarded as boys, could not fail to break the social ties that had till then held them all together. Ça vous amuse, la vie. Honestly, the lessons of education were becoming too trite. Hay himself, probably for the first time, felt half glad that Roosevelt should want him to stay in office, if only to save himself the trouble of quitting, but to Adams all was pure loss. On that side his education had been finished at school. His friends in power were lost, and he knew life too well to risk total wreck by trying to save them. As far as concerned Roosevelt, the chance was hopeless. To them at 63, Roosevelt at 43 could not be taken seriously in his old character, and could not be recovered in his new one. Power, when wielded by abnormal energy, is the most serious of facts, and all Roosevelt's friends know that his restless and combative energy was more than abnormal. Roosevelt, more than any other man living within the range of notoriety, showed the singular primitive quality that belongs to ultimate matter, the quality that medieval theology assigned to God. He was pure act. With him wielding unmeasured power with immeasurable energy in the White House, the relation of age to youth, of teacher to pupil, was altogether out of place, and no other was possible. Even Hay's relation was a false one, while Adams's ceased of itself. History's truths are little valuable now, but human nature retains a few of its archaic proverbial laws, and the wisest courtier that ever lived, Lucius Seneca himself, must have remained in some shade of doubt what advantage he should get from the power of his friend and pupil Nero Claudius, until as a gentleman past 60 he received Nero's filial invitation to kill himself. Seneca closed the vast circle of his knowledge by learning that a friend in power was a friend lost, a fact very much worth insisting upon. While the gray-headed moth that had fluttered through the many moth administrations and had singed his wings more or less in them all, though he now slept 9 months out of 12, acquired an instinct of self-preservation that kept him to the north side of Lafayette Square, and after a sufficient habitude of presidents and senators deterred him from hovering between them. Those who seek education in the paths of duty are always deceived by the illusion that power in the hands of friends is an advantage to them. As far as Adams could teach experience, he was bound to warn them that he had found it an invariable disaster. Power is poison. Its effects on presidents had always been tragic, chiefly as an almost insane excitement at first, and a worse reaction afterwards, but also because no mind is so well balanced as to bear the strain of seizing unlimited force without habit or knowledge of it. and finding it disputed with him by hungry packs of wolves and hounds whose lives depend on snatching the carrion. Roosevelt enjoyed a singularly direct nature and honest intent, but he lived naturally in restless agitation that would have worn out most tempers in a month, and his first year of presidency showed chronic excitement that made a friend tremble. The effect of unlimited power on limited mind is worth noting in presidents, because it must represent the same process in society, and the power of self-control must have limits somewhere in face of the control of the infinite. Here education seemed to see its first and last lesson, but this is a matter of psychology which lies far down in the depths of history and of science. It will recur in other forms. The personal lesson is different. Roosevelt was lost, but this seemed no reason why Hay and Lodge should also be lost, yet the result was mathematically certain. With Hay it was only the steady decline of strength and the necessary economy of force, but with Lodge it was the law of politics. He could not help himself, for his position as the President's friend and independent statesman at once was false, and he must be unsure in both relations. To a student the importance of Cabot Lodge was great, much greater than that of the usual senator, but it hung on his position in Massachusetts rather than on his control of executive patronage, and his standing in Massachusetts was highly insecure. Nowhere in America was society so complex or change so rapid. No doubt the Bostonian had always been noted for a certain chronic irritability, a sort of Bostonitis, which, in its primitive Puritan forms, seemed due to knowing too much of his neighbors and thinking too much of himself. Many years earlier, William M. Evarts had pointed out to Adams the impossibility of uniting New England behind a New England leader. The trait led to good ends, such as admiration of Abraham Lincoln and George Washington, but the virtue was exacting, for New England standards were various, scarcely reconcilable with each other, and constantly multiplying in number until balance between them threatened to become impossible. The old ones were quite difficult enough. State Street and the banks exacted one stamp, the old Congregational clergy another. Harvard College, poor in votes but rich in social influence, a third. The foreign element, especially the Irish, held aloof and seldom consented to approve anyone. The new socialist class, rapidly growing, promised to become more exclusive than the Irish. New power was disintegrating society and setting independent centers of force to work until money had all it could do to hold the machine together. No one could represent it faithfully as a whole. Naturally, Adams's sympathies lay strongly with Lodge, but the task of appreciation was much more difficult in his case than in that of his chief friend and scholar, the President. As a type for study, or a standard for education, Lodge was the more interesting of the two. Roosevelts are born and never can be taught, but Lodge was a creature of teaching, Boston incarnate, the child of his local parentage, and while his ambition led him to be more, the intent, though virtuous, was, as Adams admitted in his own case, restless. An excellent talker, a voracious reader, a ready wit, an accomplished orator, with a clear mind and a powerful memory, he could never feel perfectly at ease whatever leg he stood on, but shifted, sometimes with painful strain of temper, from one sensitive muscle to another, uncertain whether to pose as an uncompromising Yankee, or a pure American, or a patriot in the still purer atmosphere of Irish, Germans, or Jews, or a scholar and historian of Harvard College. English to the last fibre of his thought, saturated with English literature, English tradition, English taste, revolted by every vice and by most virtues of Frenchmen and Germans, or any other continental standards, but at home and happy among the vices and extravagances of Shakespeare, standing first on the social, then on the political foot, now worshipping, now banning, shocked by the wanton display of immorality, but practising the license of political usage, sometimes bitter, often genial, always intelligent. Lodge had the singular merit of interesting. The usual statesmen flocked in swarms like crows, black and monotonous. Lodge's plumage was varied, and, like his flight, harked back to race. He betrayed the consciousness that he and his people had a past, if they dared but avow it, and might have a future, if they could but divine it. Adams, too, was Bostonian, and the Bostonian's uncertainty of attitude was as natural to him as to Lodge. Only Bostonians can understand Bostonians and thoroughly sympathize with the inconsequences of the Boston mind. His theory and practice were also at variance. He professed in theory equal distrust of English thought, and called it a huge rag-bag of bric-a-brac, sometimes precious but never sure. For him only the Greek, the Italian, or the French standards had claims to respect, and the barbarism of Shakespeare was as flagrant as to Voltaire. But his theory never affected his practice. He knew that his artistic standard was the illusion of his own mind, that English disorder approached nearer to truth, if truth existed, than French measure or Italian line or German logic. He read his Shakespeare as the evangel of conservative Christian anarchy, neither very conservative nor very Christian, but stupendously anarchistic. He loved the atrocities of English art and society as he loved Charles Dickens and Miss Austen, not because of their example, but because of their humour. He made no scruple of defying sequence and denying consistency, but he was not a senator. Double standards are inspirational to men of letters, but they are apt to be fatal to politicians. Adams had no reason to care whether his standards were popular or not, and no one else cared more than he, but Roosevelt and Lodge were playing a game in which they were always liable to find the shifty sands of American opinion yield suddenly under their feet. With this game an elderly friend had long before carried acquaintance as far as he wished. There was nothing in it for him but the amusement of the pugilist or acrobat. The larger study was lost in the division of interests and the ambitions of fifth-rate men. But foreign affairs dealt only with large units, and made personal relation possible with Hay, which could not be maintained with Roosevelt or Lodge. As an affair of pure education, the point is worth notice, from young men who are drawn into politics. The work of domestic progress is done by masses of mechanical power, steam, electric, furnace, or other, which have to be controlled by a score or two of individuals who have shown capacity to manage it. The work of internal government has become the task of controlling these men, who are socially as remote as heathen gods, alone worth knowing but never known, and who could tell nothing of political value if one skinned them alive. Most of them have nothing to tell, but are forces as dumb as their dynamos, absorbed in the development or economy of power. They are trustees for the public, and whenever society assumes the property, it must confer on them that title. But the power will remain as before, whoever manages it, and will then control society without appeal, as it controls its stokers and pitmen. Modern politics is, at bottom, a struggle not of men, but of forces. The men become every year more and more creatures of force, massed about central power-houses. The conflict is no longer between the men, but between the motors that drive the men, and the men tend to succumb to their own motive forces. This is a moral that man strongly objects to admit, especially in medieval pursuits like politics and poetry, nor is it worth while for a teacher to insist upon it. What he insists upon is only that, in domestic politics, everyone works for an immediate object, commonly for some private job, and invariably in a near horizon, while in foreign affairs the outlook is far ahead, over a field as wide as the world. There the merest scholar could see what he was doing. For history, international relations are the only sure standards of movement, the only foundation for a map. For this reason Adams had always insisted that international relation was the only sure base for a chart of history. He cared little to convince anyone of the correctness of his view, but as teacher he was bound to explain it, and as friend he found it convenient. The Secretary of State has always stood as much alone as the historian. Required to look far ahead and round him, he measures forces unknown to party managers, and has found Congress more or less hostile ever since Congress first sat. The Secretary of State exists only to recognize the existence of a world which Congress would rather ignore, of obligations which Congress repudiates whenever it can, of bargains which Congress distrusts and tries to turn to its advantage or to reject. Since the first day the Senate existed, it has always intrigued against the Secretary of State whenever the Secretary has been obliged to extend his functions beyond the appointment of consuls in senators' service. This is a matter of history which anyone may approve or dispute as he will, but as education it gave new resources to an old scholar, for it made of Hay the best schoolmaster since 1865. Hay had become the most imposing figure ever known in the office. He had an influence that no other Secretary of State ever possessed, as he had a nation behind him such as history had never imagined. He needed to write no state papers, he wanted no help, and he stood far above counsel or advice. But he could instruct an attentive scholar as no other teacher in the world could do, and Adams sought only instruction, wanted only to chart the international channel for 50 years to come, to triangulate the future, to obtain his dimension, and fix the acceleration of movement in politics since the year 1200, as he was trying to fix it in philosophy and physics, in finance and force. Hay had been so long at the head of foreign affairs that at last the stream of events favored him. With infinite effort he had achieved the astonishing diplomatic feat of inducing the Senate, with only 6 negative votes, to permit Great Britain to renounce without equivalent treaty rights which she had for 50 years defended tooth and nail. This unprecedented triumph in his negotiations with the Senate enabled him to carry one step further his measures for general peace. About England the Senate could make no further effective opposition, for England was one, and Canada alone could give trouble. The next difficulty was with France, and there the Senate blocked advance, but England assumed the task, and owing to political changes in France effected the object, a combination which, as late as 1901, had been visionary. The next and far more difficult step was to bring Germany into the combine, while at the end of the vista, most unmanageable of all, Russia remained to be satisfied and disarmed. This was the instinct of what might be named McKinleyism, the system of combinations, consolidations, trusts, realized at home and realizable abroad. With the system, a student nurtured in ideas of the 18th century had nothing to do, and made not the least pretense of meddling, but nothing forbade him to study, and he noticed, to his astonishment, that this capitalistic scheme of combining governments, like railways or furnaces, was in effect precisely the socialist scheme of Chaoter and Babel. That John Hay of all men should adopt a socialist policy seemed an idea more absurd than conservative Christian anarchy, but paradox had become the only orthodoxy in politics as in science. When one saw the field, one realized that Hay could not help himself, nor could Babel. Either Germany must destroy England and France to create the next inevitable unification as a system of continent against continent, or she must pool interests. Both schemes in turn were attributed to the Kaiser. One or the other he would have to choose. Opinion was balanced doubtfully on their merits, but granting both to be feasible, Hay's and McKinley's statesmanship turned on the point of persuading the Kaiser to join what might be called the coal-power combination, rather than build up the only possible alternative, a gun-power combination by merging Germany in Russia. Thus Babel and Jaurès, McKinley and Hay, were partners. The problem was pretty, even fascinating, and, to an old Civil War private soldier in diplomacy, as rigorous as a geometrical demonstration. As the last possible lesson in life, it had all sorts of ultimate values. Unless education marches on both feet, theory and practice, it risks going astray, and Hay was probably the most accomplished master of both then living. He knew not only the forces but also the men, and he had no other thought than his policy. Probably this was the moment of highest knowledge that a scholar could ever reach. He had under his eyes the whole educational staff of the government at a time when the government had just reached the heights of highest activity and influence. Since 1860 education had done its worst, under the greatest masters and at enormous expense to the world, to train these two minds to catch and comprehend every spring of international action, not to mention of personal influence, and the entire machinery of politics in several great countries had little to do but supply the last and best information. Education could be carried no further. With its effects on Hay, Adams had nothing to do, but its effects on himself were grotesque. Never had the proportions of his ignorance looked so appalling. He seemed to know nothing, to be groping in darkness, to be falling forever in space, and the worst depth consisted in the assurance, incredible as it seemed, that no one knew more. He had at least the mechanical assurance of certain values to guide him, like the relative intensities of his coal powers and the relative inertia of his gun powers. But he conceived that had he known, besides the mechanics, every relative value of persons, as well as he knew the inmost thoughts of his own government, had the Czar and the Kaiser and the Mikado turned schoolmasters, like Hay, and taught him all they knew, he would still have known nothing. They knew nothing themselves. Only by comparison of their ignorance could the student measure his own. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29 The Abyss of Ignorance, 1902. The years hurried past, and gave hardly time to note their work. 3 or 4 months, though big with change, come to an end before the mind can catch up with it. Winter vanished, spring burst into flower, and again Paris opened its arms, though not for long. Mr. Cameron came over and took the castle of Inverlochy for 3 months, which he summoned his friends to garrison. Lochaber seldom laughs, except for its children, such as Camerons, Macdonalds, Campbells, and other products of the mist. But in the spring of 1902 Scotland put on fewer airs of coquetry than usual. Since the terrible harvest of 1879, which one had watched sprouting on its stalks on the Shropshire hillsides, nothing had equalled the gloom. Even when the victims fled to Switzerland, they found the Lake of Geneva and the Rhine not much gayer, and Karlsruhe not much restful than Paris, until at last, in desperation, one drifted back to the avenue of the Bois de Boulogne, and, like the cuckoo, dropped into the nest of a better citizen. Diplomacy has its uses. Reynolds Hitt, transferred to Berlin, abandoned his attic to Adams, and there, for long summers to come, he hid in ignorance and silence. Life at last managed of its own accord to settle itself into a working arrangement. After so many years of effort to find one's drift, the drift found the seeker, and slowly swept him forward and back, with a steady progress oceanwards. Such lessons as summer taught, winter tested, and one had only to watch the apparent movement of the stars in order to guess one's declination. The process is possible only for men who have exhausted automotion. Adams never knew why, knowing nothing of Faraday, he began to mimic Faraday's trick of seeing lines of force all about him, where he had always seen lines of will. Perhaps the effect of knowing no mathematics is to leave the mind to imagine figures, images, phantoms. One's mind is a watery mirror at best. But once conceived, the image became rapidly simple, and the lines of force presented themselves as lines of attraction. Repulsions counted only as battles of attractions. By this path the mind stepped into the mechanical theory of the universe before knowing it, and entered a distinct new phase of education. This was the work of the dynamo and the Virgin of Chartres. Like his masters, since thought began, he was handicapped by the eternal mystery of force, the sink of all science. For thousands of years in history he found that force had been felt as a cult attraction, love of God and lust for power in a future life. After 1500, when this attraction began to decline, philosophers fell back on some vis a tergo, instinct of danger from behind, like Darwin's survival of the fittest, and one of the greatest minds between Descartes and Newton, Pascal, saw the master motion of man in ennui, which was also scientific. Quote, "I have often said that all the troubles of man come from his not knowing how to sit still." End quote. Mere restlessness forces action. Quote, "So passes the whole of life. We combat obstacles in order to get repose, and, when got, the repose is insupportable, for we think either of the troubles we have or of those that threaten us, and even if we felt safe on every side, ennui would, of its own accord, spring up from the depths of the heart where it is rooted by nature, and would fill the mind with its venom." End quote. "If goodness lead him not, yet weariness may toss him to my breast." Ennui, like natural selection, accounted for change, but failed to account for direction of change. For that, an attractive force was essential, a force from outside, a shaping influence. Pascal and all the old philosophies called this outside force God, or gods. Caring but little for the name, and fixing only on tracing the force, Adams had gone straight to the Virgin at Chartres, and asked her to show him God, face to face, as she did for Saint Bernard. She repeated, kindly as ever, as though she were still the young mother of today, with a sort of patient pity for masculine dullness, "My dear outcast, what is it you seek? This is the Church of Christ. If you seek him through me, you are welcome, sinner or saint, but he and I are one. We are love. We have little or nothing to do with God's other energies, which are infinite, and concern us the less because our interest is only in man, and the infinite is not knowable to man. Yet, if you are troubled by your ignorance, you see how I am surrounded by the masters of the schools. Ask them." The answer sounded singularly like the usual answer of British science, which had repeated since Bacon that one must not try to know the unknowable, though one was quite powerless to ignore it. But the Virgin carried more conviction, for her feminine lack of interest in all perfections except her own was honester than the formal phrase of science, since nothing was easier than to follow her advice and turn to Thomas Aquinas, who, unlike modern physicists, answered at once and plainly. "To me," said St. Thomas, "Christ and the Mother are one force, love, simple, single, and sufficient for all human wants. But love is a human interest which acts even on man so partially that you and I, as philosophers, need expect no share in it. Therefore we turn to Christ and the schools who represent all other force. We deal with multiplicity and call it God. After the Virgin has redeemed by her personal force as love all that is redeemable in man, the schools embrace the rest and give it form, unity, and motive. This chart of force was more easily studied than any other possible scheme, for one had but to do what the Church was always promising to do, abolishing in one flash of lightning not only man, but also the Church itself, the earth, the other planets, and the sun, in order to clear the air without affecting medieval science. The student felt warranted in doing what the Church threatened, abolishing his solar system altogether, in order to look at God as actual, continuous movement, universal cause, and interchangeable force. This was pantheism, but the schools were pantheist, at least as pantheistic as the energetic of the Germans, and their deity was the ultimate energy, whose thought and act were one. Rid of man and his mind, the universe of Thomas Aquinas seemed rather more scientific than that of Haeckel or Ernst Mach. Contradiction for contradiction, attraction for attraction, energy for energy, St. Thomas's idea of God had merits. Modern science offered not a vestige of proof, or a theory of connection between its forces, or any scheme of reconciliation between thought and mechanics, while St. Thomas at least linked together the joints of his machine. As far as a superficial student could follow, the 13th century supposed mind to be a mode of force directly derived from the intelligent prime motor, and the cause of all form and sequence in the universe, therefore the only proof of unity. Without thought in the unit there could be no unity; without unity no orderly sequence or ordered society. Thought alone was form. Mind and unity flourished or perished together. This education startled even a man who had dabbled in 50 educations all over the world, for if he were obliged to insist on a universe, he seemed driven to the Church. Modern science guaranteed no unity. The student seemed to feel himself, like all his predecessors, caught, trapped, meshed in this eternal dragnet of religion. In practice, the student escapes this dilemma in two ways. The first is that of ignoring it, as one escapes most dilemmas. The second is that the Church rejects pantheism as worse than atheism, and will have nothing to do with the pantheist at any price. In wandering through the forests of ignorance, one necessarily fell upon the old famous bear that scared children at play. But even had the animal shown more logic than its victim, one had learned from Socrates to distrust, above all other traps, the trap of logic, the mirror of the mind. Yet the search for a unit of force led into catacombs of thought, where hundreds of thousands of educations had found their end. Generation after generation of painful and honest-minded scholars had been content to stay in these labyrinths forever, pursuing ignorance and silence, in company with the most famous teachers of all time. Not one of them had ever found a logical highroad of escape. Adams cared little whether he escaped or not, but he felt clear that he could not stop there, even to enjoy the society of Spinoza and Thomas Aquinas. True, the Church alone had asserted unity with any conviction, and the historian alone knew what oceans of blood and treasure the assertion had cost. But the only honest alternative to affirming unity was to deny it, and the denial would require a new education. At 65 years old, a new education promised hardly more than the old. Possibly the modern legislator or magistrate might no longer know enough to treat as the Church did the man who denied unity, unless the denial took the form of a bomb, but no teacher would know how to explain what he thought he meant by denying unity. Society would certainly punish the denial if anyone ever learned enough to understand it. Philosophers, as a rule, cared little what principles society affirmed or denied, since the philosopher commonly held that though he might sometimes be right by good luck on some point, no complex of individual opinions could possibly be anything but wrong. Yet, supposing society to be ignored, the philosopher was no further forward. Nihilism had no bottom. For thousands of years every philosopher had stood on the shore of this sunless sea, diving for pearls and never finding them. All had seen that since they could not find the bottom, they must assume it. The Church claimed to have found it, but since 1450 motives for agreeing on some new assumption of unity, broader and deeper than that of the Church, had doubled in force until even the universities and schools, like the Church and State, seemed about to be driven into an attempt to educate, though specially forbidden to do it. Like most of his generation, Adams had taken the word of science that the new unit was as good as found. It would not be an intelligence, probably not even a consciousness, but it would serve. He passed 60 years waiting for it, and at the end of that time, on reviewing the ground, he was led to think that the final synthesis of science and its ultimate triumph was the kinetic theory of gases, which seemed to cover all motion in space and to furnish the measure of time. So far as he understood it, the theory asserted that any portion of space is occupied by molecules of gas, flying in right lines at velocities varying up to a mile in a second, and colliding with each other at intervals varying up to 17,750,000 times in a second. To this analysis, if one understood it right, all matter whatever was reducible, and the only difference of opinion in science regarded the doubt whether a still deeper analysis would reduce the atom of gas to pure motion. Thus, unless one mistook the meaning of motion, which might well be, the scientific synthesis commonly called unity was the scientific analysis commonly called multiplicity. The two things were the same, all forms being shifting phases of motion. Granting this ocean of colliding atoms the last hope of humanity, what happened if one dropped the sounder into the abyss, let it go, frankly gave up unity altogether? What was unity? Why was one to be forced to affirm it? Here everybody flatly refused help. Science seemed content with its old phrase of larger synthesis, which was well enough for science, but meant chaos for man. One would have been glad to stop and ask no more, but the anarchist bomb bade one go on, and the bomb is a powerful persuader. One could not stop, even to enjoy the charms of a perfect gas colliding 17 million times in a second, much like an automobile in Paris. Science itself had been crowded so close to the edge of the abyss that its attempts to escape were as metaphysical as the leap, while an ignorant old man felt no motive for trying to escape, seeing that the only escape possible lay in the form of vis tergo, commonly called death. He got out his Descartes again, dipped into his Hume and Berkeley, wrestled anew with his Kant, pondered solemnly over his Hegel and Schopenhauer and Hartmann, strayed gaily away with his Greeks, all merely to ask what unity meant, and what happened when one denied it. Apparently one never denied it. Every philosopher, whether sane or insane, naturally affirmed it. The utmost flight of anarchy seemed to have stopped with the assertion of two principles, and even these fitted into each other, like good and evil, light and darkness. Pessimism itself, black as it might be painted, had been content to turn the universe of contradictions into the human thought as one will, and treat it as representation. Metaphysics insisted on treating the universe as one thought, or treating thought as one universe, and philosophers agreed, like a kinetic gas, that the universe could be known only as a motion of mind, and therefore as unity. One could know it only as oneself. It was psychology. Of all forms of pessimism, the metaphysical form was, for a historian, the least enticing. Of all studies, the one he would rather have avoided was that of his own mind. He knew no tragedy so heartrending as introspection, and the more because, as Mephistopheles said of Marguerite, he was not the first. Nearly all the highest intelligence known to history had drowned itself in the reflection of its own thought, and the bovine survivors had rudely told the truth about it, without affecting the intelligent. One's own time had not been exempt. Even since 1870, friends by scores had fallen victims to it. Within 25 years, a new library had grown out of it. Harvard College was a focus of the study. France supported hospitals for it. England published magazines of it. Nothing was easier than to take one's mind in one's hand and ask one's psychological friends what they made of it, and the more because it mattered so little to either party, since their minds, whatever they were, had pretty nearly ceased to reflect, and, let them do what they liked with the smallest remnant, they could scarcely do anything very new with it. All one asked was to learn what they hoped to do. Unfortunately, the pursuit of ignorance and silence had by this time led the weary pilgrim to such mountains of ignorance that he could no longer see any path whatever, and could not even understand a signpost. He failed to fathom the depths of the new psychology, which proved to him that on that side, as on the mathematical side, his power of thought was atrophied, if indeed it ever existed. Since he could not fathom the science, he could only ask the simplest of questions. Did the new psychology hold that the soul or mind was or was not a unit? He gathered from the books that the psychologists had, in a few cases, distinguished several personalities in the same mind, each conscious and constant, individual and exclusive. The fact seemed scarcely surprising, since it had been a habit of mind from earliest recorded time, and equally familiar to that last acquaintance who had taken a drug or caught a fever or eaten a Welsh rarebit before bed, for surely no one could follow the action of a vivid dream, and still need to be told that the actors evoked by his mind were not himself, but quite unknown to all he had ever recognized as self. The new psychology went further, and seemed convinced that it had actually split personality not only into dualism, but also into complex groups, like telephonic centres and systems, that might be isolated and called up at will, and whose physical action might be occult in the sense of strangeness to any known form of force. Dualism seemed to have become as common as binary stars. Alternating personalities turned up constantly, even among one's friends. The facts seemed certain, or at least as certain as other facts. All they needed was explanation. This was not the business of the searcher of ignorance, who felt himself in no way responsible for causes. To his mind, the compound soul, or mind, took at once the form of a bicycle rider mechanically balancing himself by inhibiting all his inferior personalities, and surely to fall into the subconscious chaos below, if one of his inferior personalities got on top. The only absolute truth was the subconscious chaos below, which everyone could feel when he sought it. Whether the psychologists admitted it or not mattered little to the student, who, by the law of his profession, was engaged in studying his own mind. On him the effect was surprising. He woke up with a shudder, as though he had himself fallen off his bicycle. If his mind were really this sort of magnet, mechanically dispersing its lines of force when it went to sleep, and mechanically orienting them when it woke up, which was normal, the dispersion or orientation? The mind, like the body, kept its unity unless it happened to lose balance. But the professor of physics, who slipped on a pavement and hurt himself, knew no more than an idiot what knocked him down, though he did know, what the idiot could hardly do, that his normal condition was idiocy or want of balance, and that his sanity was unstable artifice. His normal thought was dispersion, sleep, dream, inconsequence, the simultaneous action of different thought centres without central control. His artificial balance was acquired habit. He was an acrobat with a dwarf on his back, crossing a chasm on a slack rope, and commonly breaking his neck. By that path of newest science one saw no unity ahead, nothing but a dissolving mind, and the historian felt himself driven back on thought as one continuous force, without race, sex, school, country, or church. This had been always the fate of rigorous thinkers, and has always succeeded in making them famous, as it did Gibbon, Buckle, and Auguste Comte. Their method made what progress the science of history knew, which was little enough, but they did at last fix the law that if history had ever meant to correct the errors she made in detail, she must agree on a scale for the whole. Every local historian might defy this law till history ended, but its necessity would be the same for man as for space or time or force, and without it the historian would always remain a child in science. Any schoolboy could see that man as a force must be measured by motion from a fixed point. Psychology helped here by suggesting a unit, the point in history when man held the highest idea of himself as a unit in a unified universe. 8 or 10 years of study had led Adams to think he might use the century 1150 to 1250, expressed in Amiens Cathedral and the works of Thomas Aquinas, as the unit from which he might measure motion down to his own time, without assuming anything as true or untrue except relation. The movement might be studied at once in philosophy and mechanics. Setting himself to the task, he began a volume which he mentally knew as Mont Saint-Michel and Chartres, a study of 13th-century unity. From that point he proposed to fix a position for himself, which he could label The Education of Henry Adams, a study of 20th-century multiplicity. With the help of these 2 points of relation, he hoped to project his lines forward and backward indefinitely, subject to correction from anyone who should know better. Thereupon he sailed for home. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30 Vis Inertiae, 1930 Washington was always amusing, but in 1900, as in 1800, its chief interest lay in its distance from New York. The movement of New York had become planetary, beyond control, while the task of Washington in 1900, as in 1800, was to control it. The success of Washington in the past century promised ill for its success in the next. To a student who had passed the best years of his life in pondering over the political philosophy of Jefferson, Gallatin, and Madison, the problem that Roosevelt took in hand seemed alive with historical interest, but it would need at least another half-century to show its results. As yet one could not measure the forces or their arrangement. The forces had not even aligned themselves except in foreign affairs, and there one turned to seek the channel of wisdom as naturally as though Washington did not exist. The President could do nothing effectual in foreign affairs, but at least he could see something of the field. Hay had reached the summit of his career and saw himself on the edge of wreck. Committed to the task of keeping China open, he saw China about to be shut. Almost alone in the world, he represented the open door, and could not escape being crushed by it. Yet luck had been with him in full tide. Though Sir Julian Pauncefote had died in May 1902, after carrying out tasks that filled an ex-private secretary of 1861 with open-mouthed astonishment, Hay had been helped by the appointment of Michael Herbert as his successor, who counted for double the value of an ordinary diplomat. To reduce friction is the chief use of friendship, and in politics the loss by friction is outrageous. To Herbert and his wife, the small knot of houses that seemed to give a vague unity to foreign affairs opened their doors and their hearts, for the Herberts were already at home there, and this personal sympathy prolonged Hay's life, for it not only eased the effort of endurance, but it also led directly to a revolution in Germany. Down to that moment the Kaiser, rightly or wrongly, had counted as the ally of the Czar in all matters relating to the East. Holleben and Cassini were taken to be a single force in Eastern affairs, and this supposed alliance gave Hay no little anxiety and some trouble. Suddenly Holleben, who seemed to have had no thought but to obey with almost agonized anxiety the least hint of the Kaiser's will, received a telegram ordering him to pretext illness and come home, which he obeyed within 24 hours. The ways of the German Foreign Office had been always abrupt, not to say ruthless, toward its agents, and yet commonly some discontent had been shown as excuse. But in this case no cause was guessed for Holleben's disgrace, except the Kaiser's wish to have a personal representative at Washington. Breaking down all precedent, he sent Speck von Sternberg to counterbalance Herbert. Welcome as Speck was in the same social intimacy, and valuable as his presence was to Hay, the personal gain was trifling compared with the political. Of Hay's official tasks one knew no more than any newspaper reporter did, but of one's own diplomatic education the successive steps had become strides. The scholar was studying, not on Hay's account, but on his own. He had seen Hay, in 1898, bring England into his combine. He had seen the steady movement which was to bring France back into an Atlantic system, and now he saw suddenly the dramatic swing of Germany toward the West, the movement of all others nearest mathematical certainty. Whether the Kaiser meant it or not, he gave the effect of meaning to assert his independence of Russia, and to Hay this change of front had enormous value. The least was that it seemed to isolate Cassini and unmask the Russian movement, which became more threatening every month as the Manchurian scheme had to be revealed. Of course the student saw whole continents of study opened to him by the Kaiser's coup d'état. Carefully as he had tried to follow the Kaiser's career, he had never suspected such refinement of policy, which raised his opinion of the Kaiser's ability to the highest point, and altogether upset the centre of statesmanship. That Germany could be so quickly detached from separate objects and brought into an Atlantic system seemed a paradox more paradoxical than any that one's education had yet offered, though it had offered little but paradox. If Germany could be held there, a century of friction would be saved. No price would be too great for such an object, although no price could probably be wrung out of Congress as equivalent for it. The Kaiser, by one personal act of energy, freed Hay's hands so completely that he saw his problem simplified to Russia alone. Naturally, Russia was a problem 10 times as difficult. The history of Europe for 200 years had accomplished little but to state one or two sides of the Russian problem. One's year of Berlin in youth, though it taught no civil law, had opened one's eyes to the Russian enigma, and both German and French historians had labored over its proportions with a sort of fascinated horror. Germany, of all countries, was most vitally concerned in it, but even a cave-dweller in Lafayette Square, seeking only a measure of motion since the Crusades, saw before his eyes, in the spring of 1903, a survey of future order or anarchy that would exhaust the power of his telescopes and defy the accuracy of his theodolites. The drama had become passionately interesting and grew every day more Byzantine, for the Russian government itself showed clear signs of dislocation, and the orders of Lambsdorff and de Witt were reversed when applied in Manchuria. Historians and students should have no sympathies or antipathies, but Adams had private reasons for wishing well to the Czar and his people. At much length, in several labored chapters of history, he had told how the personal friendliness of the Czar Alexander I in 1810 saved the fortunes of J.Q. Adams, and opened to him the brilliant diplomatic career that ended in the White House. Even in his own effaced existence he had reasons, not altogether trivial, for gratitude to the Czar Alexander II, whose firm neutrality had saved him some terribly anxious days and nights in 1862, while he had seen enough of Russia to sympathize warmly with Prince Khilkoff's railways and de Witt's industries. The last and highest triumph of history would, to his mind, be the bringing of Russia into the Atlantic combine, and the just and fair allotment of the whole world among the regulated activities of the universe. At the rate of unification since 1840, this end should be possible within another 60 years, and in foresight of that point, Adams could already finish, provisionally, his chart of international unity. But for the moment the gravest doubts and ignorance covered the whole field. No one, Czar or diplomat, Kaiser or Mikado, seemed to know anything. Through individual Russians one could always see with ease, for their diplomacy never suggested depth, and perhaps Hay protected Cassini for the very reason that Cassini could not disguise an emotion, and never failed to betray that, in setting the enormous bulk of Russian inertia to roll over China, he regretted infinitely that he should have to roll it over Hay too. He would almost rather have rolled it over de Witt and Lambsdorff. His political philosophy, like that of all Russians, seemed fixed in the single idea that Russia must fatally roll, must, by her irresistible inertia, crush whatever stood in her way. For Hay and his pooling policy, inherited from McKinley, the fatalism of Russian inertia meant the failure of American intensity. When Russia rolled over a neighboring people, she absorbed their energies in her own movement of custom and race, which neither Czar nor peasant could convert, or wish to convert, into any Western equivalent. In 1903 Hay saw Russia knocking away the last blocks that held back the launch of this huge mass into the China Sea. The vast force of inertia known as China was to be united with the huge bulk of Russia in a single mass which no amount of new force could henceforward deflect. Had the Russian government, with the sharpest sense of enlightenment, employed scores of de Witts and Khilkoffs, and borrowed all the resources of Europe, it could not have lifted such a weight, and had no idea of trying. These were the positions charted on the map of political unity by an insect in Washington in the spring of 1903, and they seemed to him fixed. Russia held Europe and America in her grasp, and Cassini held Hay in his. The Siberian Railway offered checkmate to all possible opposition. Japan must make the best terms she could, England must go on receding, America and Germany would look on at the avalanche. The wall of Russian inertia that barred Europe across the Baltic would bar America across the Pacific, and Hay's policy of the open door would infallibly fail. Thus the game seemed lost, in spite of the Kaiser's brilliant stroke, and the movement of Russia eastward must drag Germany after it by its mere mass. To the humble student the loss of Hay's game affected only Hay. For himself the game, not the stakes, was the chief interest, and though want of habit made him object to read his newspapers blackened, since he liked to blacken them himself, he was in any case condemned to pass but a short space of time either in Siberia or in Paris, and could balance his endless columns of calculation equally in either place. The figures, not the facts, concerned his chart, and he mused deeply over his next equation. The Atlantic would have to deal with a vast continental mass of inert motion, like a glacier, which moved, and consciously moved, by mechanical gravitation alone. Russia saw herself so, and so must an American see her. He had no more to do than measure, if he could, the mass. Was volume or intensity the stronger? What and where was the vis nova that could hold its own before this prodigious ice cap of vis inertiae? What was movement of inertia, and what its laws? Naturally, a student knew nothing about mechanical laws, but he took for granted that he could learn, and went to his books to ask. He found that the force of inertia had troubled wiser men than he. The dictionary said that inertia was a property of matter, by which matter tends, when at rest, to remain so, and when in motion to move on in a straight line. Finding that his mind refused to imagine itself at rest or in a straight line, he was forced, as usual, to let it imagine something else. And since the question concerned the mind and not the matter, he decided from personal experience that his mind was never at rest, but moved, when normal, about something it called a motive, and never moved without motives to move it. So long as these motives were habitual, and their attraction regular, the consequent result might, for convenience, be called movement of inertia, to distinguish it from movement caused by new or higher attraction. But the greater the bulk to move, the greater must be the force to accelerate or deflect it. This seemed simple as running water, but simplicity is the most deceitful mistress that ever betrayed man. For years the student and the professor had gone on complaining that minds were unequally inert. The inequalities amounted to contrasts. One class of minds responded only to habit, another only to novelty. Race classified thought, class lists classified mind. No two men thought alike, and no woman thought like a man. Race inertia seemed to be fairly constant, and made the chief trouble in the Russian future. History looked doubtful when asked whether race inertia had ever been overcome without destroying the race in order to reconstruct it, but surely sex inertia had never been overcome at all. Of all movements of inertia, maternity and reproduction are the most typical, and women's property of moving in a constant line forever is ultimate, uniting history in its only unbroken and unbreakable sequence. Whatever else stops, the woman must go on reproducing, as she did in the Siluria of Pteraspis. Sex is a vital condition, and race only a local one. If the laws of inertia are to be sought anywhere with certainty, it is in the feminine mind. The American always ostentatiously ignored sex, and American history mentioned hardly the name of a woman, while English history handled them as timidly as though they were a new and undescribed species. But if the problem of inertia summed up the difficulties of the race question, it involved that of sex far more deeply, and, to Americans, vitally. The task of accelerating or deflecting the movement of the American woman had interest infinitely greater than that of any race whatever, Russian or Chinese, Asiatic or African. On this subject, as on the Senate and the banks, Adams was conscious of having been born an 18th-century remainder. As he grew older, he found that early institutions lost their interest, but that early women became a passion. Without understanding movement of sex, history seemed to him mere pedantry. So insistent had he become on this side of his subject that with women he talked of little else, and, because women's thought is mostly subconscious and particularly sensitive to suggestion, he tried tricks and devices to disclose it. The woman seldom knows her own thought; she is as curious to understand herself as the man to understand her, and responds far more quickly than the man to a sudden idea. Sometimes at dinner one might wait till talk flagged, and then, as mildly as possible, ask one's liveliest neighbor whether she could explain why the American woman was a failure. Without an instant's hesitation she was sure to answer, "Because the American man is a failure." She meant it. Adams owed more to the American woman than to all the American men he had ever heard of, and felt not the smallest call to defend his sex, who seemed able to take care of themselves. But, from the point of view of sex, he felt much curiosity to know how far the woman was right, and in pursuing this inquiry he caught the trick of affirming that the woman was the superior. Apart from truth, he owed her at least that compliment. The habit led sometimes to perilous personalities and the sudden give and take of table talk. This spring, just before sailing for Europe in May 1903, he had a message from his sister-in-law, Mrs. Brooks Adams, to say that she and her sister, Mrs. Lodge, and the Senator were coming to dinner by way of farewell. Bay Lodge and his lovely young wife sent word to the same effect. Mrs. Roosevelt joined the party, and Michael Herbert shyly slipped down to escape the solitude of his wife's absence. The party were too intimate for reserve, and they soon fell on Adams's hobby, with derision which stung him to pungent rejoinder. "The American man is a failure? You are all failures," he said. "Has not my sister here more sense than my brother Brooks? Is not Bessie worth two of Bay? Wouldn't we all elect Mrs. Lodge senator against Cabot? Would the President have a ghost of a chance if Mrs. Roosevelt ran against him? Do you want to stop at the embassy on your way home and ask which would run it best, Herbert or his wife?" The men laughed a little, not much. Each probably made allowance for his own wife as an unusually superior woman. Someone afterwards remarked that these half-dozen women were not a fair average. Adams replied that the half-dozen men were above all possible average; he could not lay his hands on another half-dozen their equals. Gay or serious, the question never failed to stir feeling. The cleverer the woman, the less she denied the failure. She was bitter at heart about it. She had failed even to hold the family together, and her children ran away like chickens with their first feathers. The family was extinct, like chivalry. She had failed not only to create a new society that satisfied her, but even to hold her own in the old society of church or state, and was left for the most part with no place but the theatre or streets to decorate. She might glitter with historical diamonds and sparkle with wit as brilliant as the gems, in rooms as splendid as any in Rome at its best, but she saw no one except her own sex who knew enough to be worth dazzling, or was competent to pay her intelligent homage. She might have her own way without restraint or limit, but she knew not what to do with herself when free. Never had the world known a more capable or devoted mother, but at 40 her task was over, and she was left with no stage except that of her old duties, or of Washington society, where she had enjoyed for 100 years every advantage, but had created only a medley where 9 men out of 10 refused her request to be civilized, and the 10th bored her. On most subjects one's opinions must defer to science, but on this, the opinion of a senator or a professor, a chairman of a state central committee or a railway president, is worth less than that of any woman on Fifth Avenue. The inferiority of man on this, the most important of all social subjects, is manifest. Adams here had no occasion to deprecate scientific opinion, since no woman in the world would have paid the smallest respect to the opinions of all professors since the serpent. His own object had little to do with theirs. He was studying the laws of motion, and had struck 2 large questions of vital importance to America: inertia of race and inertia of sex. He had seen Mr. de Witt and Prince Khilkoff turn artificial energy to the value of $3,000 million, more or less, upon Russian inertia in the last 20 years, and he needed to get some idea of the effects. He had seen artificial energy to the amount of 20 or 25 million steam horsepower created in America since 1840, and as much more economized, which had been socially turned over to the American woman, she being the chief object of social expenditure, and the household the only considerable object of American extravagance. According to scientific notions of inertia and force, what ought to be the result? In Russia, because of race and bulk, no result had yet shown itself, but in America the results were evident and undisputed. The woman had been set free, volatilized like Clerk Maxwell's perfect gas, almost brought to the point of explosion like steam. One had but to pass a week in Florida, or on any of the 100 huge ocean steamers, or walk through the Place Vendôme, or join a party of Cook's tourists to Jerusalem, to see that the woman had been set free. But these swarms were ephemeral like clouds of butterflies in season, blown away and lost, while the reproductive sources lay hidden. At Washington one saw other swarms as grave gatherings of dames or daughters, taking themselves seriously, or brides fluttering fresh pinions. But all these shifting visions, unknown before 1840, touched the true problem slightly and superficially. Behind them, in every city, town, and farmhouse, were myriads of new types, or typewriters, telephones and telegraph girls, shop clerks, factory hands, running into millions on millions, and as classes unknown to themselves as to historians. Even the schoolmistresses were inarticulate. All these new women had been created since 1840. All were to show their meaning before 1940. Whatever they were not content, as the ephemera proved, and they were hungry for illusions as ever in the 4th century of the Church. But this was probably survival, and gave no hint of the future. The problem remained, to find out whether movement of inertia, inherent in function, could take direction except in lines of inertia. This problem needed to be solved in one generation of American women, and was the most vital of all problems of force. The American woman at her best, like most other women, exerted great charm on the man, but not the charm of a primitive type. She appeared as the result of a long series of discards, and her chief interest lay in what she had discarded. When closely watched, she seemed making a violent effort to follow the man who had turned his mind and hand to mechanics. The typical American man had his hand on a lever and his eye on a curve in the road. His living depended on keeping up an average speed of 40 miles an hour, tending always to become 60, 80, or 100, and he could not admit emotions or anxieties or subconscious distractions more than he could admit whiskey or drugs without breaking his neck. He could not run his machine and a woman too. He must leave her, even though his wife, to find her own way, and all the world saw her trying to find her way by imitating him. The result was often tragic, but that was no new thing in feminine history. Tragedy had been women's lot since Eve. Her problem had been always one of physical strength, and it was as physical perfection of force that her Venus had governed nature. The woman's force had counted as inertia of rotation, and her axis of rotation had been the cradle and the family. The idea that she was weak revolted all history. It was a paleontological falsehood that even an Eocene female monkey would have laughed at. But it was surely true that if her force were to be diverted from its axis, it must find a new field, and the family must pay for it. So far as she succeeded, she must become sexless like the bees, and must leave the old energy of inertia to carry on her race. The story was not new. For thousands of years women had rebelled. They had made a fortress of religion, had buried themselves in the cloister, in self-sacrifice, in good works, or even in bad. One's studies in the 12th century, like one's studies in the 4th, as in Homeric and archaic time, showed her always busy in the illusions of heaven or of hell, ambition, intrigue, jealousy, magic. But the American woman had no illusions or ambitions or new resources, and nothing to rebel against except her own maternity. Yet the rebels increased by millions from year to year till they blocked the path of rebellion. Even her field of good works was narrower than in the 12th century. Socialism, communism, collectivism, philosophical anarchism, which promised paradise on earth for every male, cut off the few avenues of escape which capitalism had opened to the woman, and she saw before her the future reserved for machine-made, collectivist females. From the male she could look for no help. His instinct of power was blind. The Church had known more about women than science will ever know, and the historian who studied the sources of Christianity felt sometimes convinced that the Church had been made by women chiefly as her protest against man. At times the historian would have been almost willing to maintain that the man had overthrown the Church chiefly because it was feminine. After the overthrow of the Church, the woman had no refuge except such as the man created for himself. She was free, she had no illusions, she was sexless, she had discarded all that the male disliked, and although she secretly regretted the discard, she knew that she could not go backward. She must, like the man, marry machinery. Already the American man sometimes felt surprise at finding himself regarded as sexless. The American woman was oftener surprised at finding herself regarded as sexual. No honest historian can take part with or against the forces he has to study. To him, even the extinction of the human race should be merely a fact to be grouped with other vital statistics. No doubt everyone in society discussed the subject, impelled by President Roosevelt, if by nothing else, and the surface current of social opinion seemed set as strongly in one direction as the silent undercurrent of social action ran in the other. But the truth lay somewhere unconscious in the woman's breast. An elderly man, trying only to learn the law of social inertia and the limits of social divergence, could not compel the superintendent of the census to ask every young woman whether she wanted children and how many. He could not even require of an octogenarian Senate the passage of a law obliging every woman, married or not, to bear one baby, at the expense of the Treasury, before she was 30 years old, under penalty of solitary confinement for life. Yet these were vital statistics in more senses than all that bore the name, and tended more directly to the foundation of a serious society in the future. He could draw no conclusions whatever except from the birth rate. He could not frankly discuss the matter with the young women themselves, although they would have gladly discussed it, because Faust was helpless in the tragedy of woman. He could suggest nothing. The Marguerite of the future could alone decide whether she were better off than the Marguerite of the past, whether she would rather be victim to a man, a church, or a machine. Between these various forms of inevitable inertia, sex and race, the student of multiplicity felt inclined to admit that, ignorance against ignorance, the Russian problem seemed to him somewhat easier of treatment than the American. Inertia of race and bulk would require an immense force to overcome it, but in time it might perhaps be partially overcome. Inertia of sex could not be overcome without extinguishing the race, yet an immense force, doubling every few years, was working irresistibly to overcome it. One gazed mute before this ocean of darkest ignorance that had already engulfed society. Few centres of great energy lived in illusion more complete or archaic than Washington, with its simple-minded standards of the field and farm, its Southern and Western habits of life and manners, its assumptions of ethics and history. But even in Washington, society was uneasy enough to need no further fretting. One was almost glad to act the part of horseshoe crab in Quincy Bay, and admit that all was uniform, that nothing ever changed, and that the woman would swim about the ocean of future time as she had swum in the past with the garfish and the shark, unable to change. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. The Grammar of Science, 1903. Of all the travels made by man since the voyages of Dante, this new exploration along the shores of multiplicity and complexity promised to be the longest, though as yet it had barely touched two familiar regions, race and sex. Even within these narrow seas the navigator lost his bearings and followed the winds as they blew. By chance it happened that Raphael Pumpelly helped the winds, for being in Washington on his way to Central Asia, he fell to talking with Adams about these matters, and said that Wolcott Gibbs thought he got most help from a book called The Grammar of Science by Karl Pearson. To Adams's vision, Wolcott stood on the same plane with the 3 or 4 greatest minds of his century, the more so because in his ignorance he confounded him with another great mind, his rival, Willard Gibbs. And the idea that a man so incomparably superior should find help anywhere filled him with wonder. He sent for the volume and read it. From the time he sailed for Europe and reached his den on the Avenue du Bois until he took his return steamer at Cherbourg on December 26th, he did little but try to find out what Karl Pearson could have taught Wolcott Gibbs. Here came in more than ever the fatal handicap of ignorance in mathematics. Not so much the actual tool was needed as the right to judge the product of the tool. Ignorant as one was of the finer values of French or German, and often deceived by the intricacies of thought hidden in the muddiness of the medium, one could sometimes catch a tendency to intelligible meaning even in Kant or Hegel, but one had not the right to a suspicion of error where the tool of thought was algebra. Adams could see in such parts of the grammar as he could understand little more than an enlargement of Stallo's book already 20 years old. He never found out what it could have taught a master like Wolcott Gibbs. Yet the book had a historical value out of all proportion to its science. No such stride had any Englishman before taken in the lines of English thought. The progress of science was measured by the success of the grammar when, for 20 years past, Stallo had been deliberately ignored under the usual conspiracy of silence inevitable to all thought which demands new thought machinery. Science needs time to reconstruct its instruments, to follow a revolution in space. A certain lag is inevitable. The most active mind cannot instantly swerve from its path, but such revolutions are portentous, and the fall or rise of half a dozen empires interested a student of history less than the rise of the grammar of science, the more pressingly because, under the silent influence of Langley, he was prepared to expect it. For a number of years Langley had published in his Smithsonian reports the revolutionary papers that foretold the overthrow of 19th-century dogma, and among the first was the famous address of Sir William Crookes on psychical research, followed by a series of papers on Roentgen and Curie, which had steadily driven the scientific lawgivers of unity into the open. But Karl Pearson was the first to pen them up for slaughter in the schools. The phrase is not stronger than that with which the grammar of science challenged the fight. Quote, "Anything more hopelessly illogical than the statements with regard to force and matter current in elementary textbooks of science it is difficult to imagine," end quote, opened Mr. Pearson. And the responsible author of the elementary textbook, as he went on to explain, was Lord Kelvin himself. Pearson shut out of science everything which the 19th century had brought into it. He told his scholars that they must put up with a fraction of the universe, and a very small fraction at that, the circle reached by the senses, where sequence could be taken for granted, much as the deep-sea fish takes for granted the circle of light which he generates. Quote, "Order and reason, beauty and benevolence are characteristics and conceptions which we find solely associated with the mind of man." End quote. The assertion, as a broad truth, left one's mind in some doubt of its bearing, for order and beauty seemed to be associated also with the mind of a crystal, if one's senses were to be admitted as judge. But the historian had no interest in the universal truth of Pearson's or Kelvin's or Newton's laws. He sought only their relative drift or direction. And Pearson went on to say that these conceptions must stop. Quote, "Into the chaos beyond sense impressions we cannot scientifically project them." End quote. We cannot even infer them. Quote, "In the chaos behind sensations, in the beyond of the sense impressions, we cannot infer necessity, order, or routine, for these are concepts formed by the mind of man on this side of sense impressions." End quote. But we must infer chaos. Quote, "Briefly, chaos is all that science can logically assert of the supersensuous." End quote. The kinetic theory of gas is an assertion of ultimate chaos. In plain words, chaos was the law of nature. Order was the dream of man. No one means all he says, and yet very few say all they mean, for words are slippery and thought is viscous. But since Bacon and Newton, English thought had gone on impatiently protesting that no one must try to know the unknowable at the same time that everyone went on thinking about it. The result was as chaotic as kinetic gas, but with the thought a historian had nothing to do. He sought only its direction. For himself, he knew that, in spite of all the Englishmen that ever lived, he would be forced to enter supersensual chaos if he meant to find out what became of British science, or indeed of any other science. From Pythagoras to Herbert Spencer, everyone had done it, although commonly science had explored an ocean which it preferred to regard as unity or a universe, and called order. Even Hegel, who taught that every notion included its own negation, used the negation only to reach a larger synthesis, till he reached the universal which thinks itself, contradiction and all. The Church alone had constantly protested that anarchy was not order, that Satan was not God, that pantheism was worse than atheism, and that unity could not be proved as a contradiction. Karl Pearson seemed to agree with the Church, but everyone else, including Newton, Darwin, and Clerk Maxwell, had sailed gaily into the supersensual, calling it, quote, "one God, one law, one element, and one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves." End quote. Suddenly, in 1900, science raised its head and denied. Yet perhaps, after all, the change had not been so sudden as it seemed. Real and actual it certainly was, and every newspaper betrayed it, but sequence could scarcely be denied by one who had watched its steady approach, thinking the change far more interesting to history than the thought. When he reflected about it, he recalled that the flow of tide had shown itself at least 20 years before, that it had become marked as early as 1893, and that the man of science must have been sleepy indeed who did not jump up from his chair like a scared dog when, in 1898, Madame Curie threw on his desk the metaphysical bomb she called radium. There remained no hole to hide in. Even metaphysics swept back over science with the green water of the deep-sea ocean, and no one could longer hope to bar out the unknowable, for the unknowable was known. The fact was admitted that the uniformitarians of one's youth had wound about their universe a tangle of contradictions meant only for temporary support to be merged in larger synthesis, and had waited for that larger synthesis in silence and in vain. They had refused to hear Stallo. They had betrayed little interest in Crookes. At last their universe had been wrecked by rays, and Karl Pearson undertook to cut the wreck loose with an axe, leaving science adrift on a sensual raft in the middle of a supersensual chaos. The confusion seemed to a mere passenger worse than that of 1600, when the astronomers upset the world. It resembled rather the convulsion of 310, when the Civitas Dei cut itself loose from the Civitas Romae, and the cross took the place of the legions. But the historian accepted it all alike. He knew that his opinion was worthless, only in this case he found himself on the raft, personally and economically concerned in its drift. English thought had always been chaos and multiplicity itself, in which the new step of Karl Pearson marked only a consistent progress. But German thought had affected system, unity, and abstract truth, to a point that fretted the most patient foreigner, and to Germany the voyager in strange seas of thought alone might resort with confident hope of renewing his youth. Turning his back on Karl Pearson in England, he plunged into Germany, and had scarcely crossed the Rhine when he fell into libraries of new works bearing the names of Ostwald, Ernst Mach, Ernst Haeckel, and others less familiar, among whom Haeckel was easiest to approach, not only because of being the oldest and clearest and steadiest spokesman of 19th-century mechanical convictions, but also because in 1902 he had published a vehement renewal of his faith. The volume contained only one paragraph that concerned a historian. It was that in which Haeckel sank his voice almost to a religious whisper in avowing with evident effort that the proper essence of substance appeared to him more and more marvellous and enigmatic as he penetrated further into the knowledge of its attributes, matter and energy, and as he learned to know their innumerable phenomena and their evolution. Since Haeckel seemed to have begun the voyage in multiplicity that Pearson had forbidden to Englishmen, he should have been a safe pilot to the point at least of a proper essence of substance in its attributes of matter and energy. But Ernst Mach seemed to go yet one step further, for he rejected matter altogether and admitted but two processes in nature, change of place and interconversion of forms. Matter was motion, motion was matter, the thing moved. A student of history had no need to understand these scientific ideas of very great men. He sought only the relation with the ideas of their grandfathers, and their common direction toward the ideas of their grandsons. He had long ago reached with Hegel the limits of contradiction, and Ernst Mach scarcely added a shade of variety to the identity of opposites. But both of them seemed to be in agreement with Karl Pearson on the facts of the supersensual universe which could be known only as unknowable. With a deep sigh of relief the traveller turned back to France. There he felt safe. No Frenchman except Rabelais and Montaigne had ever taught anarchy other than as a path to order. Chaos would be unity in Paris even if child of the guillotine. To make this assurance mathematically sure, the highest scientific authority in France was a great mathematician, M. Poincaré of the Institute, who published in 1902 a small volume called La Science et l'Hypothèse, which purported to be relatively readable. Trusting to its external appearance, the traveller timidly bought it and greedily devoured it without understanding a single consecutive page, but catching here and there a period that startled him to the depths of his ignorance, for they seemed to show that M. Poincaré was troubled by the same historical landmarks which guided or deluded Adams himself. "In science we are led," said M. Poincaré, "to act as though a simple law, when other things were equal, must be more probable than a complicated law. Half a century ago one frankly confessed it and proclaimed that nature loves simplicity. She has since given us, too often, the lie. Today this tendency is no longer avowed, and only as much of it is preserved as is indispensable, so that science shall not become impossible." Here at last was a fixed point beyond the chance of confusion with self-suggestion. History and mathematics agreed. Had M. Poincaré shown anarchistic tastes, his evidence would have weighed less heavily. But he seemed to be the only authority in science who felt what a historian felt so strongly, the need of unity in a universe. Quote, "Considering everything, we have made some approach toward unity. We have not gone as fast as we hoped 50 years ago. We have not always taken the intended road, but definitely we have gained much ground." End quote. This was the most clear and convincing evidence of progress yet offered to the navigator of ignorance. But suddenly he fell on another view which seemed to him quite irreconcilable with the first. Quote, "Doubtless if our means of investigation should become more and more penetrating, we should discover the simple under the complex, then the complex under the simple, then anew the simple under the complex, and so on, without ever being able to foresee the last term." End quote. A mathematical paradise of endless displacement promised eternal bliss to the mathematician, but turned the historian green with horror. Made miserable by the thought that he knew no mathematics, he burned to ask whether M. Poincaré knew any history, since he began by begging the historical question altogether, and assuming that the past showed alternating phases of simple and complex, the precise point that Adams, after 50 years of effort, found himself forced to surrender. and then going on to assume alternating phases of the future, which, for the weary Titan of unity, differed in nothing essential from the kinetic theory of a perfect gas. Since monkeys first began to chatter in trees, neither man nor beast had ever denied or doubted multiplicity, diversity, complexity, anarchy, chaos. Always and everywhere the complex had been true and the contradiction had been certain. Thought started by it. Mathematics itself began by counting 1, 2, 3, then imagining their continuity, which M. Poincaré was still exhausting his wits to explain or defend, and this was his explanation. Quote, "In short, the mind has the faculty of creating symbols, and it is thus that it has constructed mathematical continuity, which is only a particular system of symbols." End quote. With the same light touch, more destructive in its artistic measure than the heaviest-handed brutality of Englishmen or Germans, he went on to upset relative truth itself. Quote, "How should I answer the question whether Euclidean geometry is true? It has no sense. Euclidean geometry is, and will remain, the most convenient." End quote. Chaos was a primary fact even in Paris, especially in Paris, as it was in the Book of Genesis. But every thinking being in Paris or out of it had exhausted thought in the effort to prove unity, continuity, purpose, order, law, truth, the universe, God, after having begun by taking it for granted and discovering to their profound dismay that some minds denied it. The direction of mind as a single force of nature had been constant since history began. Its own unity had created a universe the essence of which was abstract truth, the absolute, God. To Thomas Aquinas the universe was still a person, to Spinoza a substance, to Kant truth was the essence of the I. An innate conviction, a categorical imperative, to Poincaré it was a convenience, and to Karl Pearson a medium of exchange. The historian never stopped repeating to himself that he knew nothing about it, that he was a mere instrument of measure, a barometer, pedometer, radiometer, and that his whole share in the matter was restricted to the measurement of thought motion as marked by the accepted thinkers. He took their facts for granted. He knew no more than a firefly about rays, or about race, or sex, or ennui, or a bar of music, or a pang of love, or a grain of musk, or a phosphorus, or conscience, or duty, or the force of Euclidean geometry, or non-Euclidean, or heat, or light, or osmosis, or electrolysis, or the magnet, or ether, or vis inertiae, or gravitation, or cohesion, or elasticity, or surface tension, or capillary attraction, or Brownian motion, or of some scores or thousands or millions of chemical attractions, repulsions, or indifferences which were busy within and without him, or, in brief, of force itself, which, he was credibly informed, bore some dozen definitions in the textbooks, mostly contradictory, and all, as he was assured, beyond his intelligence, but summed up in the dictum of the last and highest science, that motion seems to be matter, and matter seems to be motion. Yet we are probably incapable of discovering what either is. History had no need to ask what either might be. All it needed to know was the admission of ignorance, the mere fact of multiplicity baffling science. Even as to the fact, science disputed, but radium happened to radiate something that seemed to explode the scientific magazine, bringing thought, for the time, to a standstill, though in the line of thought movement in history radium was merely the next position, familiar and inexplicable since Zeno and his arrow, continuous from the beginning of time and discontinuous at each successive point. History set it down on the record, pricked its position on the chart, and waited to be led or misled once more. The historian must not try to know what is truth if he values his honesty, for if he cares for his truths he is certain to falsify his facts. The laws of history only repeat the lines of force or thought. Yet, though his will be iron, he cannot help now and then resuming his humanity or simianity in the face of fear. The motion of thought had the same value as the motion of a cannon-ball seen approaching the observer on a direct line through the air. One could watch its curve for 5,000 years. Its first violent acceleration in historical times had ended in the catastrophe of 310. The next swerve of direction occurred toward 1500. Galileo and Bacon gave a still newer curve to it, which altered its values. But all these changes had never altered the continuity. Only in 1900 the continuity snapped. Vaguely conscious of the cataclysm, the world sometimes dated it from 1893 by the Roentgen rays, or from 1898 by the Curie's radium. But in 1904 Arthur Balfour announced on the part of British science that the human race without exception had lived and died in a world of illusion until the last year of the century. The date was convenient, and convenience was truth. The child born in 1900 would, then, be born into a new world, which would not be a unity, but a multiple. Adams tried to imagine it, and an education that would fit it. He found himself in a land where no one had ever penetrated before, where order was an accidental relation obnoxious to nature, artificial compulsion imposed on motion, against which every free energy of the universe revolted, and which, being merely occasional, resolved itself back into anarchy at last. He could not deny that the law of the new multiverse explained much that had been most obscure, especially the persistently fiendish treatment of man by man, the perpetual effort of society to establish law, and the perpetual revolt of society against the law it had established, the perpetual building up of authority by force, and the perpetual appeal to force to overthrow it, the perpetual symbolism of a higher law, and the perpetual relapse to a lower one, the perpetual victory of the principles of freedom and their perpetual conversion into principles of power. But the staggering problem was the outlook ahead into the despotism of artificial order which nature abhorred. The physicists had a phrase for it, unintelligible to the vulgar. All that we win is a battle lost in advance, with the irreversible phenomena in the background of nature. All that a historian won was a vehement wish to escape. He saw his education complete and was sorry he ever began it. As a matter of taste, he greatly preferred his 18th-century education when God was a father and nature a mother, and all was for the best in a scientific universe. He repudiated all share in the world as it was to be, and yet he could not detect the point where his responsibility began or ended. As history unveiled itself in the new order, man's mind had behaved like a young pearl oyster, secreting its universe to suit its conditions, until it had built up a shell of nacre that embodied all its notions of the perfect. Man knew it was true because he made it, and he loved it for the same reason. He sacrificed millions of lives to acquire his unity, but he achieved it and justly thought it a work of art. The woman especially did great things, creating her deities on a higher level than the male, and in the end compelling the man to accept the Virgin as guardian of the man's God. The man's part in his universe was secondary, but the woman was at home there, and sacrificed herself without limit to make it habitable, when man permitted it, as sometimes happened for brief intervals of war and famine. But she could not provide protection against forces of nature. She did not think of her universe as a raft to which the limpets stuck for life in the surge of a supersensual chaos. She conceived herself and her family as the center and flower of an ordered universe which she knew to be unity because she had made it after the image of her own fecundity, and this creation of hers was surrounded by beauties and perfections which she knew to be real because she herself had imagined them. Even the masculine philosopher admired and loved and celebrated her triumph, and the greatest of them sang it in the noblest of his verses. Alma Venus, coeli subter labentia signa quae mare navigerum. Quae terras frugiferentes concelebras. Quae quoniam rerum naturam sola gubernas. Nec sine te quidquam dias in luminis horas exoritor, neque fit laetam, neque amabile quidquam. Te sociam studio. Neither man nor woman ever wanted to quit this Eden of their own invention, and could no more have done it of their own accord than the pearl oyster could quit its shell. But although the oyster might perhaps assimilate or embalm a grain of sand forced into its aperture, it could only perish in face of the cyclonic hurricane or the volcanic upheaval of its bed. Her supersensual chaos killed her. Such seemed the theory of history to be imposed by science on the generation born after 1900. For this theory Adams felt himself in no way responsible. Even as historian, he had made it his duty always to speak with respect of everything that had ever been thought respectable, except an occasional statesman. But he had submitted to force all his life, and he meant to accept it for the future as for the past. All his efforts had been turned only to the search for its channel. He never invented his facts; they were furnished him by the only authorities he could find. As for himself, according to Helmholtz, Ernst Mach, and Arthur Balfour, he was henceforth to be a conscious ball of vibrating motions, traversed in every direction by infinite lines of rotation or vibration, rolling at the feet of the Virgin at Chartres, or of M. Poincaré in an attic at Paris, a centre of supersensual chaos. The discovery did not distress him. A solitary man of 65 years or more, alone in a Gothic cathedral or a Paris apartment, need fret himself little about a few illusions, more or less. He should have learned his lesson 50 years earlier. The times had long passed when a student could stop before chaos or order. He had no choice but to march with his world. Nevertheless, he could not pretend that his mind felt flattered by this scientific outlook. Every fabulist has told how the human mind has always struggled like a frightened bird to escape the chaos which caged it, how, appearing suddenly and inexplicably out of some unknown and unimaginable void, passing half its known life in the mental chaos of sleep, victim, even when awake, to its own ill-adjustment, to disease, to age, to external suggestion, to nature's compulsion, doubting its sensations, and in the last resort trusting only to instruments and averages. After 60 or 70 years of growing astonishment, the mind wakes to find itself looking blankly into the void of death. That it should profess itself pleased by this performance was all that the highest rules of good breeding could ask, but that it should actually be satisfied would prove that it existed only as idiocy. Satisfied, the future generation could scarcely think itself, for even when the mind existed in a universe of its own creation, it had never been quite at ease. As far as one ventured to interpret actual science, the mind had thus far adjusted itself by an infinite series of infinitely delicate adjustments forced on it by the infinite motion of an infinite chaos of motion, dragged at one moment into the unknowable and unthinkable, then trying to scramble back within its senses and to bar the chaos out, but always assimilating bits of it, until at last, in 1900, a new avalanche of unknown forces had fallen on it, which required new mental powers to control. If this view was correct, the mind could gain nothing by flight or by fight. It must merge in its supersensual multiverse, or succumb to it. End of Chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32. Vis Nova, 1903 to 1904. Paris after midsummer is a place where only the industrious poor remain, unless they can get away. But Adams knew no spot where history would be better off, and the calm of the Champs-Élysées was so deep that when Mr. de Witt was promoted to a powerless dignity, no one whispered that the promotion was disgrace, while one might have supposed, from the silence, that the Viceroy Alexiev had reoccupied Manchuria as a fulfillment of treaty obligation. For once the conspiracy of silence became crime. Never had so modern and so vital a riddle been put before Western society, but society shut its eyes. Manchuria knew every step into the war, Japan had completed every preparation, Alexiev had collected his army and fleet at Port Arthur, mounting his siege guns and laying in enormous stores, ready for the expected attack. From Yokohama to Irkutsk the whole East was under war conditions, but Europe knew nothing. The banks would not allow disturbance. The press said not a word, and even the embassies were silent. Every anarchist in Europe buzzed excitement and began to collect in groups, but the Hotel Ritz was calm, and the Grand Dukes who swarmed there professed to know directly from the Winter Palace that there would be no war. As usual, Adams felt as ignorant as the best informed statesman, and although the sense was familiar, for once he could see that the ignorance was assumed. After nearly 50 years of experience, he could not understand how the comedy could be so well acted. Even as late as November, diplomats were gravely asking every passer-by for his opinion, and avowed none of their own except what was directly authorized at St. Petersburg. He could make nothing of it. He found himself in face of his new problem, the workings of Russian inertia, and he could conceive no way of forming an opinion how much was real and how much was comedy had he been in the Winter Palace himself. At times he doubted whether the Grand Dukes or the Tsar knew, but old diplomatic training forbade him to admit such innocence. This was the situation at Christmas when he left Paris. On January 6, 1904, he reached Washington, where the contrast of atmosphere astonished him, for he had never before seen his country think as a world power. No doubt Japanese diplomacy had much to do with this alertness, but the immense superiority of Japanese diplomacy should have been more evident in Europe than in America, and in any case could not account for the total disappearance of Russian diplomacy. A government by inertia greatly disconcerted study. One was led to suspect that Cassini never heard from his government, and that Lambsdorff knew nothing of his own department. Yet no such suspicion could be admitted. Cassini resorted to transparent blague. Quote, "Japan seemed infatuated even to the point of war, but what can the Japanese do? As usual, sit on their heels and pray to Buddha." End quote. One of the oldest and most accomplished diplomatists in the service could never show his hands so empty as this, if he held a card to play. But he never betrayed stronger resource behind. Quote, "If any Japanese succeed in entering Manchuria, they will never get out alive." End quote. The inertia of Cassini, who was naturally the most energetic of diplomatists, deeply interested a student of race inertia, whose mind had lost itself in the attempt to invent scales of force. The air of official Russia seemed most dramatic in the air of the White House, by contrast with the outspoken candor of the President. Reticence had no place there. Everyone in America saw that, whether Russia or Japan were victim, one of the decisive struggles in American history was pending, and any pretense of secrecy or indifference was absurd. Interest was acute and curiosity intense, for no one knew what the Russian government meant or wanted, while war had become a question of days. To an impartial student who gravely doubted whether the Czar himself acted as a conscious force or an inert weight, the straightforward avowals of Roosevelt had singular value as a standard of measure. By chance it happened that Adams was obliged to take the place of his brother, Brooks, at the diplomatic reception immediately after his return home, and the part of proxy included his supping at the President's table, with Secretary Root on one side, the President opposite, and Miss Chamberlain between them. Naturally, the President talked and the guests listened, which seemed, to one who had just escaped from the European conspiracy of silence, like drawing a free breath after stifling. Roosevelt, as everyone knew, was always an amusing talker, and had the reputation of being indiscreet beyond any other man of great importance in the world, except the Kaiser Wilhelm and Mr. Joseph Chamberlain, the father of his guest at table, and this evening he spared none. With the usual abuse of the quos ego, common to vigorous statesmen, he said all that he thought about Russians and Japanese, as well as about Boers and British, without restraint, in full hearing of 20 people, to the entire satisfaction of his listener, and concluded by declaring that war was imminent, that it ought to be stopped, that it could be stopped. "I could do it myself. I could stop it tomorrow." And he went on to explain his reasons for restraint. That he was right, and that within another generation his successor would do what he would have liked to do, made no shadow of doubt in the mind of his hearer, though it would have been folly when he last supped at the White House in the dynasty of President Hayes. But the listener cared less for the assertion of power than for the vigor of view. The truth was evident enough, ordinary, even commonplace if one liked, but it was not a truth of inertia, nor was the method to be mistaken for inert. Nor could the force of Japan be mistaken for a moment as a force of inertia, although its aggressive was taken as methodically, as mathematically, as a demonstration of Euclid, and Adams thought that, as against any but Russians, it would have lost its opening. Each day counted as a measure of relative energy on the historical scale, and the whole story made a grammar of new science quite as instructive as that of Pearson. The forces thus launched were bound to reach some new equilibrium which would prove the problem in one sense or another, and the war had no personal value for Adams except that it gave Hay his last great triumph. He had carried on his long contest with Cassini so skilfully that no one knew enough to understand the diplomatic perfection of his work, which contained no error. But such success is complete only when it is invisible, and his victory at last was victory of judgment, not of act. He could do nothing, and the whole country would have sprung on him had he tried. Japan and England saved his open door and fought his battle. All that remained for him was to make the peace, and Adams set his heart on getting the peace quickly in hand, for Hay's sake as well as for that of Russia. He thought then that it could be done in one campaign, for he knew that, in a military sense, the fall of Port Arthur must lead to negotiation, and everyone felt that Hay would inevitably direct it. But the race was close, and while the war grew every day in proportions, Hay's strength every day declined. St. Gaudens came on to model his head, and Sargent painted his portrait, two steps essential to immortality which he bore with a certain degree of resignation, but he grumbled when the President made him go to St. Louis to address some gathering at the Exposition, and Mrs. Hay bade Adams go with them, for whatever use he could suppose himself to serve. He professed the religion of World's Fairs, without which he held education to be a blind impossibility, and obeyed Mrs. Hay's bidding the more readily because it united his two educations in one. But theory and practice were put to equally severe test at St. Louis. 10 years had passed since he had crossed the Mississippi, and he found everything new. In this great region from Pittsburgh through Ohio and Indiana, agriculture had made way for steam. Tall chimneys reeked smoke on every horizon, and dirty suburbs filled with scrap iron, scrap paper, and cinders formed the setting of every town. Evidently cleanliness was not to be the birthmark of the new American, but this matter of discards concerned the measure of force little, while the chimneys and cinders concerned it so much that Adams thought the Secretary of State should have rushed to the platform at every station to ask who were the people, for the American of the prime seemed to be extinct with the Shawnee and the buffalo. The subject grew quickly delicate. History told little about these millions of Germans and Slavs, or whatever their race names, who had overflowed these regions as though the Rhine and the Danube had turned their floods into the Ohio. John Hay was as strange to the Mississippi River as though he had not been bred on its shores, and the city of St. Louis had turned its back on the noblest work of nature, leaving it bankrupt between its own banks. The new American showed his parentage proudly. He was the child of steam and the brother of the dynamo, and already, within less than 30 years, this mass of mixed humanities, brought together by steam, was squeezed and welded into approach to shape, a product of so much mechanical power and bearing no distinctive marks but that of its pressure. The new American, like the new European, was the servant of the power-house, as the European of the 12th century was the servant of the Church, and the features would follow the parentage. The St. Louis Exposition was its first creation in the 20th century, and for that reason acutely interesting. One saw here a third-rate town of 500,000 people, without history, education, unity, or art, and with little capital, without even an element of natural interest except the river which it studiously ignored, but doing what London, Paris, or New York would have shrunk from attempting. This new social conglomerate, with no tie but its steam power, and not much of that, threw away $30 or $40 million on a pageant as ephemeral as a stage-flat. The world had never witnessed so marvelous a phantasm. By night Arabia's crimson sands had never returned a glow half so astonishing, as one wandered among long lines of white palaces, exquisitely lighted by thousands on thousands of electric candles, soft, rich, shadowy, palpable in their sensuous depths, all in deep silence, profound solitude, listening for a voice or a footfall or the plash of an oar, as though the Emir Mirza were displaying the beauties of this city of brass, which could show nothing half so beautiful as this illumination, with its vast, white, monumental solitude, bathed in the pure light of setting suns. One enjoyed it with iniquitous rapture, not because of exhibits, but rather because of their want. Here was a paradox like the stellar universe that fitted one's mental faults. Had there been no exhibits at all, and no visitors, one would have enjoyed it only the more. Here education found new forage. That the power was wasted, the art indifferent, the economic failure complete, added just so much to the interest. The chaos of education approached a dream. One asked oneself whether this extravagance reflected the past or imagined the future, whether it was a creation of the old American or a promise of the new one. No prophet could be believed, but a pilgrim of power, without constituency to flatter, might allow himself to hope. The prospect from the Exposition was pleasant. One seemed to see almost an adequate motive for power, almost a scheme for progress. In another half-century the people of the Central Valleys should have hundreds of millions to throw away more easily than in 1900 they could throw away tens, and by that time they might know which they wanted. Possibly they might even have learned how to reach it. This was an optimist's hope, shared by few except pilgrims of World's Fairs, and frankly dropped by the multitude, for east of the Mississippi the St. Louis Exposition met a deliberate conspiracy of silence, discouraging, beyond measure, to an optimistic dream of future strength in American expression. The party got back to Washington on May 24th, and before sailing for Europe, Adams went over one warm evening to bid good-bye on the garden porch of the White House. He found himself the first person who urged Mrs. Roosevelt to visit the Exposition for its beauty, and as far as he knew, the last. He left St. Louis May 22, 1904, and on Sunday, June 5th, found himself again in the town of Coutances, where the people of Normandy had built, toward the year 1250, an exposition which architects still admired and tourists visited, for it was thought singularly expressive of force as well as of grace in the Virgin. On this Sunday, the Norman world was celebrating a pretty church feast, the Fête Dieu, and the streets were filled with altars to the Virgin, covered with flowers and foliage, the pavements strewn with paths of leaves and the spring handiwork of nature, the cathedral densely thronged at Mass. The scene was graceful. The Virgin did not shut her costly exposition on Sunday or any other day, even to American senators who had shut the St. Louis Exposition to her, or for her, and a historical tramp would gladly have offered a candle or even a candlestick in her honor if she would have taught him her relation with the deity of the senators. The power of the Virgin had been plainly one, embracing all human activity, while the power of the Senate or its deity seemed, might one say, to be more or less ashamed of man and his work. The matter had no great interest as far as it concerned the somewhat obscure mental processes of senators, who could probably have given no clearer idea than priests of the deity they supposed themselves to honor, if that was indeed their purpose, but it interested a student of force, curious to measure its manifestations. Apparently the Virgin, or her son, had no longer the force to build expositions that one cared to visit, but had the force to close them. The force was still real, serious, and at St. Louis had been anxiously measured in actual money value. That it was actual and serious in France, as in the Senate chamber at Washington, proved itself at once by forcing Adams to buy an automobile, which was a supreme demonstration, because this was the form of force which Adams most abominated. He had set aside the summer for study of the Virgin, not as a sentiment, but as a motive power, which had left monuments widely scattered and not easily reached. The automobile alone could unite them in any reasonable sequence, and although the force of the automobile, for the purposes of a commercial traveller, seemed to have no relation whatever to the force that inspired a Gothic cathedral, the Virgin in the 12th century would have guided and controlled both bagman and architect, as she controlled the seeker of history. In his mind the problem offered itself as to Newton. It was a matter of mutual attraction, and he knew it, in his own case, to be a formula as precise as S equals gt² divided by 2, if he could but experimentally prove it. Of the attraction he needed no proof on his own account. The costs of his automobile were more than sufficient, but as teacher he needed to speak for others than himself. For him the Virgin was an adorable mistress, who led the automobile and its owner where she would, to her wonderful palaces and chateaux, from Chartres to Rouen, and there to Amiens and Laon, and a score of others, kindly receiving, amusing, charming, and dazzling her lover, as though she were Aphrodite herself, worth all else that man ever dreamed. He never doubted her force, since he felt it to the last fibre of his being, and could no more dispute its mastery than he could dispute the force of gravitation, of which he knew nothing but the formula. He was only too glad to yield himself entirely, not to her charm or to any sentimentality of religion, but to her mental and physical energy of creation, which had built up these World's Fairs of 13th-century force that turned Chicago and St. Louis pale. "Both were faiths and both are gone," said Matthew Arnold of the Greek and Norse divinities, but the business of a student was to ask where they had gone. The Virgin had not even altogether gone. Her fading away had been excessively slow. Her adorer had pursued her too long, too far, and in too many manifestations of her power, to admit that she had any equivalent, either of quantity or kind, in the actual world, but he could still less admit her annihilation as energy. So he went on wooing, happy in the thought that at last he had found a mistress who could see no difference in the age of her lovers. Her own age had no time measure. For years past, incited by John Lafarge, Adams had devoted his summer schooling to the study of her glass at Chartres and elsewhere, and if the automobile had one vitesse more useful than another, it was that of a century a minute, that of passing from one century to another without break. The centuries dropped like autumn leaves in one's road, and one was not fined for running over them too fast. When the 13th lost breath, the 14th caught on, and the 16th ran close ahead. The hunt for the Virgin's glass opened rich preserves. Especially the 16th century ran riot in sensuous worship. Then the ocean of religion which had flooded France broke into Shelley's light dissolved in star showers thrown, which had left every remote village strewn with fragments that flashed like jewels and were tossed into hidden clefts of peace and forgetfulness. One dared not pass a parish church in Champagne or Touraine without stopping to look for its windows of fragments, where one's glass discovered the Christ-child in his manger, nursed by the head of a fragmentary donkey, with a Cupid playing into its long ears from the balustrade of a Venetian palace, guarded by a legless Flemish Leibwache, standing on his head with a broken halbert, all invoked in prayer by remnants of the donors and their children that might have been drawn by Fouquet or Pinturicchio, in colours as fresh and living as the day they were burned in, and with feeling that still consoled the faithful for the paradise they had paid for and lost. France abounds in 16th-century glass. Paris alone contains acres of it, and the neighbourhood within 50 miles contains scores of churches where the student may still imagine himself 300 years old, kneeling before the Virgin's window in the silent solitude of an empty faith, crying his culp, beating his breast, confessing his historical sins, weighed down by the rubbish of 66 years' education, and still desperately hoping to understand. He understood a little, though not much. The 16th century had a value of its own, as though the one had become several, and unity had counted more than three, though the multiples still showed modest numbers. The glass had gone back to the Roman Empire and forward to the American continent. It betrayed sympathy with Montaigne and Shakespeare, but the Virgin was still supreme. At Beauvais, in the church of St. Stephen, was a superb tree of Jesse, famous as the work of Engrand le Prince, about 1570 or 1580, in whose branches, among the 14 ancestors of the Virgin, 3/4 bore features of the kings of France, among them Francis I and Henry II, who were hardly more edifying than the kings of Israel, and at least unusual as sources of divine purity. Compared with the still more famous tree of Jesse at Chartres, dating from 1150 or thereabouts, must one declare that Engrand le Prince proved progress? And in what direction? Complexity, multiplicity, even a step toward anarchy, it might suggest. But what step toward perfection? One late afternoon at midsummer, the Virgin's pilgrim was wandering through the streets of Troyes in close and intimate conversation with Thibaut of Champagne, and his highly intelligent seneschal, the Sieur de Joinville, when he noticed one or two men looking at a bit of paper stuck in a window. Approaching, he read that Monsieur de Plehve had been assassinated at St. Petersburg. The mad mixture of Russia and the Crusades, of the Hippodrome and the Renaissance, drove him for refuge into the fascinating church of St. Pantaleon near by. Martyrs, murderers, Caesars, saints, and assassins, half in glass and half in telegram, chaos of time, place, morals, forces, and motive, gave him vertigo. Had one sat all one's life on the steps of Ara Coeli for this? Was assassination forever to be the last word of progress? No one in the street had shown a sign of protest. He himself felt none. The charming church, with its delightful windows, in its exquisite absence of other tourists, took a keener expression of celestial peace than could have been given it by any contrast short of explosive murder. The conservative Christian anarchist had come to his own, but which was he, the murderer or the murdered? The Virgin herself never looked so winning, so won, as in this scandalous failure of her grace. To what purpose had she existed if, after 1900 years, the world was bloodier than when she was born? The stupendous failure of Christianity tortured history. The effort for unity could not be a partial success. Even alternating unity resolved itself into meaningless motion at last. To the tired student, the idea that he must give it up seemed sheer senility. As long as he could whisper, he would go on as he had begun, bluntly refusing to meet his Creator, with the admission that the creation had taught him nothing except that the square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle might, for convenience, be taken as equal to something else. Every man with self-respect enough to become effective, if only as a machine, has had to account to himself, for himself, somehow, and to invent a formula of his own for his universe, if the standard formulas failed. There, whether finished or not, education stopped. The formula, once made, could be but verified. The effort must begin at once, for time pressed. The old formulas had failed, and a new one had to be made, but after all the object was not extravagant or eccentric. One sought no absolute truth. One sought only a spool on which to wind the thread of history without breaking it. Among indefinite possible orbits, one sought the orbit which would best satisfy the observed movement of the runaway star Groombridge, 1838, commonly called Henry Adams. As term of a 19th-century education, one sought a common factor for certain definite historical fractions. Any schoolboy could work out the problem if he were given the right to state it in his own terms. Therefore, when the fogs and frosts stopped his slaughter of the centuries and shut him up again in his garret, he sat down as though he were again a boy at school, to shape, after his own needs, the values of a dynamic theory of history. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 33. A Dynamic Theory of History, 1904. A dynamic theory, like most theories, begins by begging the question. It defines progress as the development and economy of forces. Further, it defines force as anything that does, or helps to do, work. Man is a force. So is the sun. So is a mathematical point, though without dimensions or known existence. Man commonly begs the question again by taking for granted that he captures the forces. A dynamic theory, assigning attractive force to opposing bodies in proportion to the law of mass, takes for granted that the forces of nature capture man. The sum of force attracts. The feeble atom or molecule called man is attracted. He suffers education or growth. He is the sum of the forces that attract him. His body and his thought are alike their product. The movement of the forces controls the progress of his mind, since he can know nothing but the motions which impinge on his senses, whose sum makes education. For convenience as an image, the theory may liken man to a spider in its web, watching for chance prey. Forces of nature dance like flies before the net, and the spider pounces on them when it can. But it makes many fatal mistakes, though its theory of force is sound. The spider mind acquires a faculty of memory, and with it a singular skill of analysis and synthesis, taking apart and putting together in different relations the meshes of its trap. Man had in the beginning no power of analysis or synthesis approaching that of the spider, or even of the honey bee, but he had acute sensibility to the higher forces. Fire taught him secrets that no other animal could learn. Running water probably taught him even more, especially in his first lessons of mechanics. The animals helped to educate him, thrusting themselves into his hands merely for the sake of their food, and carrying his burdens or supplying his clothing. The grasses and grains were academies of study. With little or no effort on his part, all these forces formed his thought, induced his action, and even shaped his figure. Long before history began, his education was complete, for the record could not have been started until he had been taught to record. The universe that had formed him took shape in his mind as a reflection of his own unity, containing all forces except himself. Either separately or in groups, or as a whole, these forces never ceased to act on him, enlarging his mind as they enlarged the surface foliage of a vegetable, and the mind needed only to respond, as the forests did, to these attractions. Susceptibility to the highest forces is the highest genius. Selection between them is the highest science. Their mass is the highest educator. Man always made, and still makes, grotesque blunders in selecting and measuring forces, taken at random from the heap, but he never made a mistake in the value he set on the whole, which he symbolized as unity and worshipped as God. To this day his attitude toward it has never changed, though science can no longer give to force a name. Man's function as a force of nature was to assimilate other forces as he assimilated food. He called it the love of power. He felt his own feebleness, and he sought for an ass or a camel, a bow or a sling, to widen his range of power, as he sought a fetish or a planet in the world beyond. He cared little to know its immediate use, but he could afford to throw nothing away which he could conceive to have possible value in this or any other existence. He waited for the object to teach him its use or want of use, and the process was slow. He may have gone on for hundreds of thousands of years, waiting for Nature to tell him her secrets, and, to his rivals among the monkeys, Nature has taught no more than at their start. But certain lines of force were capable of acting on individual apes, and mechanically selecting types of race or sources of variation. The individual that responded or reacted to lines of new force, then, was possibly the same individual that reacts on it now, and his conception of the unity seems never to have changed in spite of the increasing diversity of forces. But the theory of variation is an affair of other science than history, and matters nothing to dynamics. The individual or the race would be educated on the same lines of illusion, which, according to Arthur Balfour, had not essentially varied down to the year 1900. To the highest attractive energy man gave the name of divine, and for its control he invented the science called religion, a word which meant, and still means, cultivation of occult force, whether in detail or mass. Unable to define force as a unity, man symbolized it and pursued it, both in himself and in the infinite, as philosophy and theology. The mind is itself the subtlest of all known forces, and its self-introspection necessarily created a science which had the singular value of lifting his education, at the start, to the finest, subtlest, and broadest training both in analysis and synthesis, so that, if language is a test, he must have reached his highest powers early in his history, while the mere motive remained as simple an appetite for power as the tribal greed which led him to trap an elephant. Hunger, whether for food or for the infinite, sets in motion multiplicity and infinity of thought, and the sure hope of gaining a share of infinite power in eternal life would lift most minds to the effort. He had reached this completeness 5,000 years ago, and added nothing to his stock of known forces for a very long time. The mass of nature exercised on him so feeble an attraction that one can scarcely account for his apparent motion. Only a historian of very exceptional knowledge would venture to say at what date between 3000 B.C. and 1000 A.D. the momentum of Europe was greatest. But such progress as the world made consisted in economies of energy rather than in its development. It was proved in mathematics, measured by names like Archimedes, Aristarchus, Ptolemy, and Euclid, or in civil law, measured by a number of names which Adams had begun life by failing to learn, or in coinage, which was most beautiful near its beginning and most barbarous at its close, or it was shown in roads, or the size of ships or harbors, or by the use of metals, instruments, and writing, all of them economies of force, sometimes more forceful than the forces they helped. But the roads were still travelled by the horse, the ass, the camel, or the slave. The ships were still propelled by sails or oars. The lever, the spring, and the screw bounded the region of applied mechanics. Even the metals were old. Much the same thing could be said of religious or supernatural forces. Down to the year 300 of the Christian era they were little changed, and in spite of Plato and the skeptics, were more apparently chaotic than ever. The experience of 3,000 years had educated society to feel the vastness of nature, and the infinity of her resources of power, but even this increase of attraction had not yet caused economies in its methods of pursuit. There the Western world stood till the year A.D. 305, when the Emperor Diocletian abdicated, and it was there that Adams broke down on the steps of Ara Coeli, his path blocked by the scandalous failure of civilization at the moment it had achieved complete success. In the year 305 the Empire had solved the problems of Europe more completely than they had ever been solved since. The Pax Romana, the civil law, and free trade should in 400 years have put Europe far in advance of the point reached by modern society in the 400 years since 1500, when conditions were less simple. The efforts to explain or explain away this scandal had been incessant, but none suited Adams unless it were the economic theory of adverse exchanges and exhaustion of minerals. But nations are not ruined beyond a certain point by adverse exchanges, and Rome had by no means exhausted her resources. On the contrary, the empire developed resources and energies quite astounding. No other 400 years of history before A.D. 1800 knew anything like it. And although some of these developments, like the civil law, the roads, aqueducts, and harbors, were rather economies than force, yet in northwestern Europe alone the empire had developed three energies, France, England, and Germany, competent to master the world. The trouble seemed rather to be that the empire developed too much energy, and too fast. A dynamic law requires that two masses, nature and man, must go on, reacting upon each other without stop, as the sun and a comet react on each other, and that any appearance of stoppage is illusive. The theory seems to exact excess rather than deficiency of action and reaction to account for the dissolution of the Roman Empire, which should, as a problem of mechanics, have been torn to pieces by acceleration. If the student means to try the experiment of framing a dynamic law, he must assign values to the forces of attraction that caused the trouble, and in this case he has them in plain evidence. With the relentless logic that stamped Roman thought, the empire, which had established unity on earth, could not help establishing unity in heaven. It was induced by its dynamic necessities to economize the gods. The Church has never ceased to protest against the charge that Christianity ruined the empire, and with its usual force has pointed out that its reforms alone saved the state. Any dynamic theory gladly admits it. All it asks is to find and follow the force that attracts. The Church points out this force in the cross, and history needs only to follow it. The empire loudly asserted its motive. Good taste forbids saying that Constantine the Great speculated as audaciously as a modern stockbroker on values of which he knew at the utmost only the volume, or that he merged all uncertain forces into a single trust which he enormously overcapitalized and forced on the market. But this is the substance of what Constantine himself said in his Edict of Milan in the year 313, which admitted Christianity into the trust of state religions. Regarded as an act of Congress, it runs, quote, "We have resolved to grant to Christians, as well as all others, the liberty to practice the religion they prefer, in order that whatever exists of divinity or celestial power may help and favor us and all who are under our government." End quote. The empire pursued power, not merely spiritual but physical, in the sense in which Constantine issued his army order the year before, at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in hoc signo vinces, using the cross as a train of artillery, which to his mind it was. Society accepted it in the same character. 80 years afterward, Theodosius marched against his rival Eugene with the cross for physical champion, and Eugene raised the image of Hercules to fight for the pagans, while society on both sides looked on as though it were a boxing match to decide a final test of force between the divine powers. The Church was powerless to raise the ideal. What is now known as religion affected the mind of old society but little. The laity, the people, the million, almost to a man, bet on the gods as they bet on a horse. No doubt the Church did all it could to purify the process, but society was almost wholly pagan in its point of view, and was drawn to the cross because, in its system of physics, the cross had absorbed all the old occult or fetish power. The symbol represented the sum of nature, the energy of modern science, and society believed it to be as real as X-rays. Perhaps it was. The emperors used it like gunpowder in politics. The physicians used it like rays in medicine. The dying clung to it as the quintessence of force, to protect them from the forces of evil on their road to the next life. Throughout these 4 centuries the empire knew that religion disturbed economy, for even the cost of heathen incense affected the exchanges. But no one could afford to buy or construct a costly and complicated machine when he could hire an occult force at trifling expense. Fetish power was cheap and satisfactory, down to a certain point. Turgot and Auguste Comte long ago fixed this stage of economy as a necessary phase of social education, and historians seem now to accept it as the only gain yet made towards scientific history. Great numbers of educated people, perhaps a majority, cling to the method still and practice it more or less strictly, but until quite recently no other was known. The only occult power at man's disposal was fetish. Against it no mechanical force could compete, except within narrow limits. Outside of occult or fetish power, the Roman world was incredibly poor. It knew but one productive energy resembling a modern machine: the slave. No artificial force of serious value was applied to production or transportation, and when society developed itself so rapidly in political and social lines, it had no other means of keeping its economy on the same level than to extend its slave system and its fetish system to the utmost. The result might have been stated in a mathematical formula as early as the time of Archimedes, 600 years before Rome fell. The economic needs of a violently centralizing society forced the empire to enlarge its slave system until the slave system consumed itself and the empire too, leaving society no resource but further enlargement of its religious system in order to compensate for the losses and horrors of the failure. For a vicious circle, its mathematical completeness approached perfection. The dynamic law of attraction and reaction needed only a Newton to fix it in algebraic form. At last, in 410, Alaric sacked Rome, and the slave-ridden, agricultural, uncommercial Western Empire, the poorer and less Christianized half, went to pieces. Society, though terribly shocked by the horrors of Alaric's storm, felt still more deeply the disappointment in its new power, the Cross, which had failed to protect its Church. The outcry against the Cross became so loud among Christians that its literary champion, Bishop Augustine of Hippo, a town between Algiers and Tunis, was led to write a famous treatise in defence of the Cross, familiar still to every scholar, in which he defended feebly the mechanical value of the symbol, arguing only that pagan symbols equally failed, but insisted on its spiritual value in the Civitas Dei, which had taken the place of the Civitas Romae in human interest. Quote, "Granted that we have lost all we had, have we lost faith? Have we lost piety? Have we lost the wealth of the inner man who is rich before God? These are the wealth of Christians." End quote. The Civitas Dei, in its turn, became the sum of attraction for the Western world, though it also showed the same weakness in mechanics that had wrecked the Civitas Romae. St. Augustine and his people perished at Hippo toward 430, leaving society in appearance dull to new attraction. Yet the attraction remained constant. The delight of experimenting on occult force of every kind is such as to absorb all the free thought of the human race. The gods did their work. History has no quarrel with them. They led, educated, enlarged the mind, taught knowledge, betrayed ignorance, stimulated effort. So little is known about the mind, whether social, racial, sexual, or heritable, whether material or spiritual, whether animal, vegetable, or mineral, that history is inclined to avoid it altogether. But nothing forbids one to admit, for convenience, that it may assimilate food like the body, storing new force and growing like a forest with the storage. The brain has not yet revealed its mysterious mechanism of gray matter. Never has nature offered it so violent a stimulant as when she opened to it the possibility of sharing infinite power in eternal life, and it might well need 1,000 years of prolonged and intense experiment to prove the value of the motive. During these so-called Middle Ages, the Western mind reacted in many forms on many sides, expressing its motives in modes, such as Romanesque and Gothic architecture, glass windows and mosaic walls, sculpture and poetry, war and love, which still affect some people as the noblest work of man, so that even today great masses of idle and ignorant tourists travel from far countries to look at Ravenna and San Marco, Palermo and Pisa, Assisi, Cordoba, Chartres, with vague notions about the force that created them, but with a certain surprise that a social mind of such singular energy and unity should still lurk in their shadows. The tourist more rarely visits Constantinople or studies the architecture of Sancta Sophia, but when he does, he is distinctly conscious of forces not quite the same. Justinian had not the simplicity of Charlemagne. The Eastern Empire showed an activity and variety of forces that the classical Europe had never possessed. The navy of Nicephorus Phocas in the 10th century would have annihilated in half an hour any navy that Carthage or Athens or Rome ever set afloat. The dynamic scheme began by asserting rather recklessly that between the pyramids, B.C. 3000, and the Cross, A.D. 300, no new force affected Western progress, and antiquarians may easily dispute the fact. But in any case the motive influence, old or new, which raised both pyramids and cross, was the same attraction of power in a future life that raised the dome of Sancta Sophia and the cathedral at Amiens, however much it was altered, enlarged, or removed to distance and space. Therefore no single event has more puzzled historians than the sudden unexplained appearance of at least two new natural forces of the highest educational value in mechanics, for the first time within record of history. Literally, these two forces seemed to drop from the sky at the precise moment when the cross on one side and the crescent on the other proclaimed the complete triumph of the Civitas Dei. Had the Manichaean doctrine of good and evil as rival deities been orthodox, it would alone have accounted for this simultaneous victory of hostile powers. Of the compass, as a step toward demonstration of the dynamic law, one may confidently say that it proved better than any other force the widening scope of the mind, since it widened immensely the range of contact between nature and thought. The compass educated. This must prove itself as needing no proof. Of Greek fire and gunpowder the same thing cannot certainly be said, for they have the air of accidents due to the attraction of religious motives. They belong to the spiritual world, or to the doubtful ground of magic which lay between good and evil. They were chemical forces, mostly explosives, which acted and still act as the most violent educators ever known to man. But they were justly feared as diabolic, and whatever insolence man may have risked toward the milder teachers of his infancy, he was an abject pupil toward explosives. The Sieur de Joinville left a record of the energy with which the relatively harmless Greek fire educated and enlarged the French mind in a single night in the year 1249, when the Crusaders were trying to advance on Cairo. The good King St. Louis and all his staff dropped upon their knees at every fiery flame that flew by, praying, "God have pity on us." And never had man more reason to call on his gods than they, for the battle of religion between Christian and Saracen was trifling compared with that of education between gunpowder and the cross. The fiction that society educated itself, or aimed at a conscious purpose, was upset by the compass and gunpowder, which dragged and drove Europe at will through frightful bogs of learning. At first the apparent lag for want of volume in the new energies lasted 1 or 2 centuries, which closed the great epochs of emotion by the Gothic cathedrals and scholastic theology. The moment had Greek beauty and more than Greek unity, but it was brief, and for another century or two Western society seemed to float in space without apparent motion. Yet the attractive mass of nature's energy continued to attract, and education became more rapid than ever before. Society began to resist, but the individual showed greater and greater insistence, without realizing what he was doing. When the Crescent drove the Cross in ignominy from Constantinople in 1453, Gutenberg and Fust were printing their first Bible at Mainz under the impression that they were helping the Cross. When Columbus discovered the West Indies in 1492, the Church looked on it as a victory of the Cross. When Luther and Calvin upset Europe half a century later, they were trying, like St. Augustine, to substitute the Civitas Dei for the Civitas Romae. When the Puritans set out for New England in 1620, they too were looking to found a Civitas Dei in State Street, and when Bunyan made his pilgrimage in 1678, he repeated St. Jerome. Even when, after centuries of license, the Church reformed its discipline, and, to prove it, burned Giordano Bruno in 1600, besides condemning Galileo in 1630, as science goes on repeating to us every day, it condemned anarchists, not atheists. None of the astronomers were irreligious men. All of them made a point of magnifying God through his works, a form of science which did their religion no credit. Neither Galileo nor Kepler nor Spinoza nor Descartes, neither Leibniz nor Newton, any more than Constantine the Great, if so much, doubted unity. The utmost range of their heresies reached only its personality. This persistence of thought inertia is the leading idea of modern history. Except as reflected in himself, man has no reason for assuming unity in the universe, or an ultimate substance or a prime motor. The a priori insistence on this unity ended by fatiguing the more active or reactive minds, and Lord Bacon tried to stop it. He urged society to lay aside the idea of evolving the universe from a thought, and to try evolving thought from the universe. The mind should observe and register forces, take them apart and put them together, without assuming unity at all. Quote, "Nature, to be commanded, must be obeyed. The imagination must be given not wings, but weights." End quote. As Galileo reversed the action of earth and sun, Bacon reversed the relation of thought to force. The mind was thenceforth to follow the movement of matter, and unity must be left to shift for itself. The revolution in attitude seemed voluntary, but in fact was as mechanical as the fall of a feather. Man created nothing. After 1500 the speed of progress so rapidly surpassed man's gait as to alarm everyone, as though it were the acceleration of a falling body which the dynamic theory takes it to be. Lord Bacon was as much astonished by it as the Church was, and with reason. Suddenly society felt itself dragged into situations altogether new and anarchic, situations which it could not affect, but which painfully affected it. Instinct taught it that the universe in its thought must be in danger when its reflection lost itself in space. The danger was all the greater because men of science covered it with larger synthesis, and poets called the undevout astronomer mad. Society knew better. Yet the telescope held it rigidly standing on its head. The microscope revealed a universe that defied the senses. Gunpowder killed whole races that lagged behind. The compass coerced the most imbruted mariner to act on the impossible idea that the earth was round. The press drenched Europe with anarchism. Europe saw itself violently resisting, wrenched into false positions, drawn along new lines as a fish that is caught on a hook, but unable to understand by what force it was controlled. The resistance was often bloody, sometimes humorous, always constant. Its contortions in the 18th century are best studied in the wit of Voltaire. But all history and all philosophy, from Montaigne and Pascal to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, deal with nothing else, and still, throughout it all, the Baconian law held good. Thought did not evolve nature, but nature evolved thought. Not one considerable man of science dared face the stream of thought, and the whole number of those who acted, like Franklin, as electric conductors of the new forces from nature to man, down to the year 1800, did not exceed a few score, confined to a few towns in Western Europe. Asia refused to be touched by the stream, and America, except for Franklin, stood outside. Very slowly the accretion of these new forces, chemical and mechanical, grew in volume until they acquired sufficient mass to take the place of the old religious science, substituting their attraction for the attractions of the Civitas Dei. But the process remained the same. Nature, not mind, did the work that the sun does on the planets. Man depended more and more absolutely on forces other than his own, and on instruments which superseded his senses. Bacon foretold it. Quote, "Neither the naked hand nor the understanding, left to itself, can effect much. It is by instruments and helps that the work is done." End quote. Once done, the mind resumed its illusion, and society forgot its impotence. But no one better than Bacon knew its tricks, and for his true followers science always meant self-restraint, obedience, sensitiveness to impulse from without. Non figendum aut excogitandum, sed inveniendum quid natura faciet aut ferat. The success of this method staggers belief, and even today can be treated by history only as a miracle of growth, like the sports of nature. Evidently a new variety of mind had appeared. Certain men merely held out their hands, like Newton watched an apple, like Franklin flew a kite, like Watt played with a tea-kettle, and great forces of nature stuck to them as though she were playing ball. Governments did almost nothing but resist. Even gunpowder and ordnance, the great weapon of government, showed little development between 1400 and 1800. Society was hostile or indifferent, as Priestley and Jenner and even Fulton, with reason, complained in the most advanced societies in the world, while its resistance became acute wherever the Church held control, until all mankind seemed to draw itself out in a long series of groups, dragged on by an attractive power in advance, which even the leaders obeyed without understanding, as the planets obeyed gravity or the trees obeyed heat and light. The influx of new force was nearly spontaneous. The reaction of mind on the mass of nature seemed not greater than that of a comet on the sun, and had the spontaneous influx of force stopped in Europe, society must have stood still, or gone backward, as in Asia or Africa. Then only economies of process would have counted as new force, and society would have been better pleased, for the idea that new force must be in itself a good is only an animal or vegetable instinct. As nature developed her hidden energies, they tended to become destructive. Thought itself became tortured, suffering reluctantly, impatiently, painfully, the coercion of new method. Easy thought had always been movement of inertia, and mostly mere sentiment, but even the processes of mathematics measured feebly the needs of force. The stupendous acceleration after 1800 ended in 1900 with the appearance of the new class of supersensual forces, before which the man of science stood at first as bewildered and helpless as, in the 4th century, a priest of Isis before the cross of Christ. This, then, or something like this, would be a dynamic formula of history. Any schoolboy knows enough to object at once that it is the oldest and most universal of all theories. Church and state, theology and philosophy have always preached it, differing only in the allotment of energy between nature and man. Whether the attractive energy has been called God or nature, the mechanism has always been the same, and history is not obliged to decide whether the ultimate tends to a purpose or not, or whether ultimate energy is one or many. Everyone admits that the will is a free force, habitually decided by motives. No one denies that motives exist adequate to decide the will, even though it may not always be conscious of them. Science has proved that forces, sensible and occult, physical and metaphysical, simple and complex, surround, traverse, vibrate, rotate, repel, attract without stop; that man's senses are conscious of few, and only in a partial degree; but that, from the beginning of organic existence, his consciousness has been induced, expanded, trained in the lines of his sensitiveness, and that the rise of his faculties from a lower power to a higher, or from a narrower to a wider field, may be due to the function of assimilating and storing outside force or forces. There is nothing unscientific in the idea that beyond the lines of force felt by the senses, the universe may be, as it has always been, either a supersensuous chaos or a divine unity, which irresistibly attracts, and is either life or death to penetrate. Thus far, religion, philosophy, and science seem to go hand in hand. The schools begin their vital battle only there. In the earlier stages of progress, the forces to be assimilated were simple and easy to absorb, but as the mind of man enlarged its range, it enlarged the field of complexity, and must continue to do so, even into chaos, until the reservoirs of sensuous or supersensuous energies are exhausted, or cease to affect him, or until he succumbs to their excess. For past history, this way of grouping its sequences may answer for a chart of relations, although any serious student would need to invent another, to compare or correct its errors. But past history is only a value of relation to the future, and this value is wholly one of convenience, which can be tested only by experiment. Any law of movement must include, to make it a convenience, some mechanical formula of acceleration. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 34, A Law of Acceleration, 1904. Images are not arguments, rarely even lead to proof, but the mind craves them, and, of late more than ever, the keenest experimenters find 20 images better than one, especially if contradictory, since the human mind has already learned to deal in contradictions. The image needed here is that of a new center or preponderating mass, artificially introduced on earth in the midst of a system of attractive forces that previously made their own equilibrium, and constantly induced to accelerate its motion till it shall establish a new equilibrium. A dynamic theory would begin by assuming that all history, terrestrial or cosmic, mechanical or intellectual, would be reducible to this formula, if we knew the facts. For convenience, the most familiar image should come first, and this is probably that of the comet or meteoric streams, like the Leonids and Perseids, a complex of minute mechanical agencies reacting within and without, and guided by the sum of forces attracting or deflecting it. Nothing forbids one to assume that the man meteorite might grow as an acorn does, absorbing light, heat, electricity, or thought, for in recent times such transference of energy has become a familiar idea. But the simplest figure at first is that of a perfect comet, say that of 1843, which drops from space in a straight line, at the regular acceleration of speed, directly into the sun, and after wheeling sharply about it in heat that ought to dissipate any known substance, turns back unharmed in defiance of law by the path on which it came. The mind, by analogy, may figure as such a comet, the better because it also defies law. Motion is the ultimate object of science, and measures of motion are many, but with thought, as with matter, the true measure is mass in its astronomic sense, the sum or difference of attractive forces. Science has quite enough trouble in measuring its material motions without volunteering help to the historian, but the historian needs not much help to measure some kinds of social movement, and especially in the 19th century, society by common accord agreed in measuring its progress by coal output. The ratio of increase in the volume of coal power may serve as dynamometer. The coal output of the world, speaking roughly, doubled every 10 years between 1840 and 1900 in the form of utilized power, for the ton of coal yielded 3 or 4 times as much power in 1900 as in 1840. Rapid as this rate of acceleration in volume seems, it may be tested in 1,000 ways without greatly reducing it. Perhaps the ocean steamer is nearest unity and easiest to measure, for anyone might hire in 1905, for a small sum of money, the use of 30,000 steam horsepower to cross the ocean, and by halving this figure every 10 years, he got back to 234 horsepower for 1835, which was accurate enough for his purposes. In truth, his chief trouble came not from the ratio in volume of heat, but from the intensity, since he could get no basis for a ratio there. All ages of history have known high intensities, like the iron furnace, the burning glass, the blowpipe, but no society has ever used high intensities on any large scale till now, nor can a mere bystander decide what range of temperature is now in common use. Loosely guessing that science controls habitually the whole range, from absolute zero to 3,000 degrees centigrade, one might assume, for convenience, that the 10-year ratio for volume could be used temporarily for intensity, and still there remained a ratio to be guessed for other forces than heat. Since 1800, scores of new forces had been discovered. Old forces had been raised to higher powers, as could be measured in the navy gun. Great regions of chemistry had been opened up and connected with other regions of physics. Within 10 years a new universe of force had been revealed in radiation. Complexity had extended itself on immense horizons, and arithmetical ratios were useless for any attempt at accuracy. The force evolved seemed more like explosion than gravitation, and followed closely the curve of steam. But, at all events, the 10-year ratio seemed carefully conservative. Unless the calculator was prepared to be instantly overwhelmed by physical force and mental complexity, he must stop there. Thus, taking the year 1900 as the starting point for carrying back the series, nothing was easier than to assume a 10-year period of retardation as far back as 1820. But beyond that point the statistician failed, and only the mathematician could help. Laplace would have found it child's play to fix a ratio of progression in mathematical science between Descartes, Leibniz, Newton, and himself. Watt could have given in pounds the increase of power between Newcomen's engines and his own. Volta and Benjamin Franklin would have stated their progress as absolute creation of power. Dalton could have measured minutely his advance on Boerhaave. Napoleon I must have had a distinct notion of his own numerical relation to Louis XIV. No one in 1789 doubted the progress of force, least of all those who were to lose their heads by it. Pending agreement between these authorities, theory may assume what it likes, say a 50 or even a 5 and 20 year of reduplication for the 18th century, for the period matters little until the acceleration itself is admitted. The subject is even more amusing in the 17th than in the 18th century, because Galileo and Kepler, Descartes, Huygens, and Isaac Newton took vast pains to fix the laws of acceleration for moving bodies, while Lord Bacon and William Harvey were content with showing experimentally the fact of acceleration in knowledge. But from their combined results a historian might be tempted to maintain a similar rate of movement back to 1600, subject to correction from the historians of mathematics. The mathematicians might carry their calculations back as far as the 14th century, when algebra seems to have become, for the first time, the standard measure of mechanical progress in Western Europe, for not only Copernicus and Tycho Brahe, but even artists like Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Albert Dürer worked by mathematical processes. and their testimony would probably give results more exact than that of Montaigne or Shakespeare. But to save trouble, one might tentatively carry back the same ratio of acceleration or retardation to the year 1400, with the help of Columbus and Gutenberg, so taking a uniform rate during the whole 4 centuries, 1400 to 1800, and leaving to statisticians the task of correcting it. Or, better, one might for convenience use the formula of squares to serve for a law of mind. Any other formula would do as well, either of chemical explosion or electrolysis, or vegetable growth, or of expansion or contraction in innumerable forms, but this happens to be simple and convenient. Its force increases in the direct ratio of its squares. As the human meteoroid approached the sun, or center of attractive force, the attraction of one century squared itself to give the measure of attraction in the next. Behind the year 1400 the process certainly went on, but the progress becomes so slight as to be hardly measurable. What was gained in the East or elsewhere cannot be known, but forces, called loosely Greek fire and gunpowder, came into use in the West in the 13th century, as well as instruments like the compass, the blowpipe, clocks and spectacles, and materials like paper. Arabic notation and algebra were introduced, while metaphysics and theology acted as violent stimulants to mind. An architect might detect a sequence between the Church of St. Peter's at Rome, the Amiens Cathedral, the Duomo at Pisa, San Marco at Venice, Sancta Sophia at Constantinople, and the churches at Ravenna. All the historian dares affirm is that a sequence is manifestly there, and he has a right to carry back his ratio to represent the fact, without assuming its numerical correctness. On the human mind as a moving body, the break in acceleration in the Middle Ages is only apparent. The attraction worked through shifting forms of force, as the sun works by light or heat, electricity, gravitation, or what not, on different organs with different sensibilities, but with invariable law. The science of prehistoric man has no value except to prove that the law went back into indefinite antiquity. A stone arrowhead is as convincing as a steam engine. The values were as clear 100,000 years ago as now, and extended equally over the whole world. The motion at last became infinitely slight, but cannot be proved to have stopped. The motion of Newton's comet at aphelion might be equally slight. To evolutionists may be left the processes of evolution. To historians, the single interest is the law of reaction between force and force, between mind and nature, the law of progress. The great division of history into phases by Turgot and Comte first affirmed this law in its outlines by asserting the unity of progress, for a mere phase interrupts no growth, and nature shows innumerable such phases. The development of coal power in the 19th century furnished the first means of assigning closer values to the elements, and the appearance of supersensual forces toward 1900 made this calculation a pressing necessity, since the next step became infinitely serious. A law of acceleration, definite and constant as any law of mechanics, cannot be supposed to relax its energy to suit the convenience of man. No one is likely to suggest a theory that man's convenience has been consulted by nature at any time, or that nature has consulted the convenience of any of her creations, except perhaps the Terebratula. In every age man has bitterly and justly complained that nature hurried and hustled him, for inertia almost invariably has ended in tragedy. Resistance is its law, and resistance to superior mass is futile and fatal. 50 years ago science took for granted that the rate of acceleration could not last. The world forgets quickly, but even today the habit remains of founding statistics on the faith that consumption will continue nearly stationary. 2 generations with John Stuart Mill talked of this stationary period, which was to follow the explosion of new power. All the men who were elderly in the 40s died in this faith, and other men grew old nursing the same conviction, and happy in it, while science for 50 years permitted or encouraged society to think that force would prove to be limited in supply. This mental inertia of science lasted through the 80s before showing signs of breaking up, and nothing short of radium fairly wakened men to the fact, long since evident, that force was inexhaustible. Even then the scientific authorities vehemently resisted. Nothing so revolutionary had happened since the year 300. Thought had more than once been upset, but never caught and whirled about in the vortex of infinite forces. Power leaped from every atom, and enough of it to supply the stellar universe showed itself running to waste at every pore of matter. Man could no longer hold it off. Forces grasped his wrists and flung him about as though he had hold of a live wire or a runaway automobile, which was very nearly the exact truth for the purposes of an elderly and timid single gentleman in Paris who never drove down the Champs Elysees without expecting an accident and commonly witnessing one, or found himself in the neighborhood of an official without calculating the chances of a bomb. So long as the rate of progress held good, these bombs would double in force and number every 10 years. Impossibilities no longer stood in the way. One's life had fattened on impossibilities. Before the boy was 6 years old he had seen 4 impossibilities made actual: the ocean steamer, the railway, the electric telegraph, and the daguerreotype. Nor could he ever learn which of the 4 had most hurried others to come. He had seen the coal output of the United States grow from nothing to 300 million tons or more. What was far more serious, he had seen the number of minds engaged in pursuing force, the truest measure of its attraction, increase from a few scores or hundreds in 1838 to many thousands in 1905, trained to sharpness never before reached, and armed with instruments amounting to new senses of indefinite power and accuracy, while they chased force into hiding places where nature herself had never known it to be, making analyses that contradicted being, and syntheses that endangered the elements. No one could say that the social mind now failed to respond to new force, even when the new force annoyed it horribly. Every day nature violently revolted, causing so-called accidents with enormous destruction of property and life, while plainly laughing at man, who helplessly groaned and shrieked and shuddered, but never for a single instant could stop. The railways alone approached the carnage of war. Automobiles and firearms ravaged society until an earthquake became almost a nervous relaxation. An immense volume of force had detached itself from the unknown universe of energy, while still vaster reservoirs, supposed to be infinite, steadily revealed themselves, attracting mankind with more compulsive course than all the Pontic seas, or gods, or gold that ever existed, and feeling still less of retiring ebb. In 1850 science would have smiled at such romance as this, but in 1900, as far as history could learn, few men of science thought it a laughing matter. If a perplexed but laborious follower could venture to guess their drift, it seemed in their minds a toss-up between anarchy and order. Unless they should be more honest with themselves in the future than they ever were in the past, they would be more astonished than their followers when they reached the end. If Karl Pearson's notions of the universe were sound, men like Galileo, Descartes, Leibniz, and Newton should have stopped the progress of science before 1700, supposing them to have been honest in their religious convictions. In 1900 they were plainly forced back on faith in a unity unproved and an order they had themselves disproved. They had reduced their universe to a series of relations to themselves. They had reduced themselves to motion in a universe of motions, with an acceleration, in their own case, of vertiginous violence. With the correctness of their science, history had no right to meddle, since their science now lay in a plane where scarcely 100 or 200 minds in the world could follow its mathematical processes. But bombs educate vigorously, and even wireless telegraphy or airships might require the reconstruction of society. If any analogy whatever existed between the human mind on one side and the laws of motion on the other, the mind had already entered a field of attraction so violent that it must immediately pass beyond into new equilibrium, like the comet of Newton, or suffer dissipation altogether, like meteoroids in the earth's atmosphere. If it behaved like an explosive, it must rapidly recover equilibrium. If it behaved like a vegetable, it must reach its limits of growth. And even if it acted like the earlier creations of energy, the saurians and sharks, it must have nearly reached the limits of its expansion. If science were to go on doubling or quadrupling its complexities every 10 years, even mathematics would soon succumb. An average mind had succumbed already in 1850. It could no longer understand the problem in 1900. Fortunately, a student of history had no responsibility for the problem. He took it as science gave it, and waited only to be taught. With science or with society he had no quarrel, and claimed no share of authority. He had never been able to acquire knowledge, still less to impart it, and if he had at times felt serious differences with the American of the 19th century, he felt none with the American of the 20th. For this new creation, born since 1900, a historian asked no longer to be teacher or even friend. He asked only to be pupil, and promised to be docile for once, even though trodden underfoot. For he could see that the new American, the child of incalculable coal power, chemical power, electric power, and radiating energy as well as of new forces yet undetermined, must be a sort of god compared with any former creation of nature. At the rate of progress since 1800, every American who lived to the year 2000 would know how to control unlimited power. He would think in complexities unimaginable to an earlier mind. He would deal with problems altogether beyond the range of earlier society. To him the 19th century would stand on the same plane with the fourth, equally childlike, and he would only wonder how both of them, knowing so little and so weak in force, should have done so much. Perhaps he might even go back, in 1964, to sit with Gibbon on the steps of Ara Coeli. Meanwhile he was getting an education. With that, a teacher who had failed to educate even the generation of 1870 dared not interfere. The new forces would educate. History saw few lessons in the past that would be useful in the future, but one, at least, it did see. The attempt of the American of 1800 to educate the American of 1900 had not often been surpassed for folly, and since 1800 the forces and their complications had increased 1,000 times or more. The attempt of the American of 1900 to educate the American of 2000 must be even blinder than that of the Congressman of 1800, except so far as he had learned his ignorance. During a million or two of years, every generation in turn had toiled with endless agony to attain and apply power, all the while betraying the deepest alarm and horror at the power they created. The teacher of 1900, if foolhardy, might stimulate; if foolish, might resist; if intelligent, might balance, as wise and foolish have often tried to do from the beginning. But the forces would continue to educate, and the mind would continue to react. All the teacher could hope was to teach it reaction. Even there his difficulty was extreme. The most elementary books of science betrayed the inadequacy of old implements of thought. Chapter after chapter closed with phrases such as one never met in older literature. The cause of this phenomenon is not understood. Science no longer ventures to explain causes. The first step toward a causal explanation still remains to be taken. Opinions are very much divided, in spite of the contradictions involved. Science gets on only by adopting different theories, sometimes contradictory. Evidently, the new American would need to think in contradictions, and instead of Kant's famous four antimonies, the new universe would know no law that could not be proved by its anti-law. To educate, oneself to begin with, had been the effort of one's life for 60 years, and the difficulties of education had gone on doubling with the coal output, until the prospect of waiting another 10 years in order to face a seventh doubling of complexities allured one's imagination but slightly. The law of acceleration was definite, and did not require 10 years more study except to show whether it held good. No scheme could be suggested to the new American, and no fault needed to be found or complaint made. But the next great influx of new forces seemed near at hand, and its style of education promised to be violently coercive. The movement from unity into multiplicity, between 1200 and 1900, was unbroken in sequence and rapid in acceleration. Prolonged one generation longer, it would require a new social mind. As though thought were common salt in indefinite solution, it must enter a new phase, subject to new laws. Thus far, since 5,000 or 10,000 years, the mind had successfully reacted, and nothing yet proved that it would fail to react. But it would need to jump. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35, Nunc Age, 1905. Nearly 40 years had passed since the ex-private secretary landed at New York with the ex-ministers Adams and Motley, when they saw American society as a long caravan stretching out toward the plains. As he came up the bay again, November 5, 1904, an older man than either his father or Motley in 1868, he found the approach more striking than ever, wonderful, unlike anything man had ever seen, and like nothing he had ever much cared to see. The outline of the city became frantic in its effort to explain something that defied meaning. Power seemed to have outgrown its servitude and to have asserted its freedom. The cylinder had exploded and thrown great masses of stone and steam against the sky. The city had the air and movement of hysteria, and the citizens were crying in every accent of anger and alarm that the new forces must at any cost be brought under control, Prosperity never before imagined, power never yet wielded by man, speed never reached by anything but a meteor, had made the world irritable, nervous, querulous, unreasonable, and afraid. All New York was demanding new men, and all the new forces, condensed into corporations, were demanding a new type of man, a man with 10 times the endurance, energy, will, and mind of the old type, for whom they were ready to pay millions at sight. As one jolted over the pavements or read the last week's newspapers, the new man seemed close at hand, for the old one had plainly reached the end of his strength, and his failure had become catastrophic. Everyone saw it, and every municipal election shrieked chaos. A traveller in the highways of history looked out of the club window on the turmoil of Fifth Street, and felt himself in Rome under Diocletian, witnessing the anarchy, conscious of the compulsion, eager for the solution, but unable to conceive whence the next impulse was to come, or how it was to act. The 2000-year failure of Christianity roared upward from Broadway, and no Constantine the Great was in sight. Having nothing else to do, the traveller went on to Washington to wait the end. There Roosevelt was training Constantines and battling trusts. With the battle of trusts, a student of mechanics felt entire sympathy, not merely as a matter of politics or society, but also as a measure of motion. The trusts and corporations stood for the larger part of the new power that had been created since 1840, and were obnoxious because of their vigorous and unscrupulous energy. They were revolutionary, troubling all the old conventions and values, as the screws of ocean steamers must trouble a school of herring. They tore society to pieces and trampled it underfoot. As one of their earliest victims, a citizen of Quincy, born in 1838, had learned submission and silence, for he knew that under the laws of mechanics any change, within the range of the forces, must make his situation only worse. But he was beyond measure curious to see whether the conflict of forces would produce the new man, since no other energies seemed left on earth to breed. The new man could be only a child born of contact between the new and the old energies. Both had been familiar since childhood, as the story has shown, and neither had warped the umpire's judgment by its favors. If ever judge had reason to be impartial, it was he. The sole object of his interest and sympathy was the new man, and the longer one watched, the less could be seen of him. Of the forces behind the trusts one could see something. They owned a complete organization, with schools, training, wealth, and purpose. But of the forces behind Roosevelt one knew little. Their cohesion was slight, their training irregular, their objects vague. The public had no idea what practical system it could aim at, or what sort of men could manage it. The single problem before it was not so much to control the trusts as to create the society that could manage the trusts. The new American must be either the child of the new forces or a chance sport of nature. The attraction of mechanical power had already wrenched the American mind into a crab-like process which Roosevelt was making heroic efforts to restore to even action, and he had every right to active support and sympathy from all the world, especially from the trusts themselves, so far as they were human. But the doubt persisted whether the force that educated was really man or nature, mind or motion. The mechanical theory, mostly accepted by science, seemed to require that the law of mass should rule. In that case, progress would continue as before. In that or any other case, a 19th-century education was as useless or misleading as an 18th-century education had been to the child of 1838. But Adams had a better reason for holding his tongue. For his dynamic theory of history he cared no more than for the kinetic theory of gas, but if it were an approach to measurement of motion, it would verify or disprove itself within 30 years. At the calculated acceleration, the head of the meteor stream must very soon pass perihelion. Therefore, dispute was idle, discussion was futile, and silence, next to good temper, was the mark of sense. If the acceleration, measured by the development and economy of forces, were to continue at its rate since 1800, the mathematician of 1950 should be able to plot the past and future orbit of the human race as accurately as that of the November meteoroids. Naturally, such an attitude annoyed the players in the game, as the attitude of the umpire is apt to infuriate the spectators. Above all, it was profoundly unmoral and tended to discourage effort. On the other hand, it tended to encourage foresight and to economize waste of mind. If it was not itself education, it pointed out the economies necessary for the education of the new American. There the duty stopped. There, too, life stopped. Nature has educated herself to a singular sympathy for death. On the Antarctic glacier, nearly 5,000 feet above sea level, Captain Scott found carcasses of seals, where the animals had laboriously flopped up to die in peace. Quote, "Unless we had actually found these remains, it would have been past believing that a dying seal could have transported itself over 50 miles of rough, steep glacier surface. But the seal seems often to crawl to the shore or to the ice to die, probably from its instinctive dread of its marine enemies." End quote. In India, Purun Dars, at the end of statesmanship, sought solitude, and died in sanctity among the deer and monkeys rather than remain with man. Even in America, the Indian summer of life should be a little sunny and a little sad, like the season, and infinite in wealth and depth of tone, but never hustled. For that reason, one's own passive obscurity seemed sometimes nearer nature than John Hay's exposure. To the normal animal the instinct of sport is innate, and historians themselves were not exempt from the passion of baiting their bears. But in its turn even the seal dislikes to be worried to death in age by creatures that have not the strength or the teeth to kill him outright. On reaching Washington, November 14, 1904, Adams saw at a glance that Hay must have rest. Already Mrs. Hay had bade him prepare to help in taking her husband to Europe as soon as the session should be over, and although Hay protested that the idea could not even be discussed, his strength failed so rapidly that he could not effectually discuss it, and ended by yielding without struggle. He would equally have resigned office and retired, like Purun Dars, had not the President and the press protested. But he often debated the subject, and his friends could throw no light on it. Adams himself, who had set his heart on seeing Hay close his career by making peace in the East, could only urge that vanity for vanity, the crown of peacemaker was worth the cross of martyrdom. But the cross was in full sight, while the crown was still uncertain. Adams found his formula for the Russian inertia exasperatingly correct. He thought that Russia should have negotiated instantly on the fall of Port Arthur, January 1, 1905. He found that she had not the energy, but meant to wait till her navy should be destroyed. The delay measured precisely the time that Hay had to spare. The close of the session on March 4 left him barely the strength to crawl on board ship, March 18, and before his steamer had reached half her course he had revived, almost as gay as when he first lighted on the Marco house in I Street 44 years earlier. The clouds that gather round the setting sun do not always take a sober coloring from eyes that have kept watch on mortality, or at least the sobriety is sometimes scarcely sad. One walks with one's friends squarely up to the portal of life, and bids good-bye with a smile. One has done it so often. Hay could scarcely pace the deck. He nourished no illusions. He was convinced that he should never return to his work, and he talked lightly of the death sentence that he might any day expect. But he threw off the coloring of office and mortality together, and the malaria of power left its only trace in the sense of tasks incomplete. One could honestly help him there. Laughing frankly at his dozen treaties hung up in the Senate committee room like lambs in a butcher's shop, one could still remind him of what was solidly completed. In his 8 years of office he had solved nearly every old problem of American statesmanship, and had left little or nothing to annoy his successor. He had brought the great Atlantic powers into a working system, and even Russia seemed about to be dragged into a combine of intelligent equilibrium based on an intelligent allotment of activities. For the first time in 1,500 years a true Roman pax was in sight, and would, if it succeeded, owe its virtues to him. Except for making peace in Manchuria, he could do no more, and if the worst should happen, setting continent against continent in arms, the only apparent alternative to his scheme, he need not repine at missing the catastrophe. This rosy view served to soothe disgusts which every parting statesman feels, and commonly with reason. One had no need to get out one's notebook in order to jot down the exact figures on either side. Why add up the elements of resistance and anarchy? The Kaiser supplied him with these figures just as the critic approached Morocco. Everyone was doing it, and seemed in a panic about it. The chaos waited only for his landing. Arrived at Genoa, the party hid itself for a fortnight at Nervi, and he gained strength rapidly as long as he made no effort and heard no call for action. Then they all went on to Nauheim without relapse. There, after a few days, Adams left him for the regular treatment, and came up to Paris. The medical reports promised well, and Hay's letters were as humorous and light-handed as ever. To the last he wrote cheerfully of his progress, and amusingly, with his usual light skepticism of his various doctors. But when the treatment ended, 3 weeks later, and he came on to Paris, he showed at the first glance that he had lost strength, and the return to affairs and interviews wore him rapidly out. He was conscious of it, and in his last talk before starting for London and Liverpool he took the end of his activity for granted. "You must hold out for the peace negotiations," was the remonstrance. "I've not time," he replied. "You'll need little time," was the rejoinder. Each was correct. There it ended. Shakespeare himself could use no more than the commonplace to express what is incapable of expression. The rest is silence. The few familiar words, among the simplest in the language, conveying an idea trite beyond rivalry, served Shakespeare, and as yet no one has said more. A few weeks afterwards, one warm evening in early July, as Adams was strolling down to dine under the trees at Armenonville, he learned that Hay was dead. He expected it. On Hay's account he was even satisfied to have his friend die, as we would all die if we could, in full fame, at home and abroad, universally regretted and wielding his power to the last. One had seen scores of emperors and heroes fade into cheap obscurity even when alive, and now at least one had not that to fear for one's friend. It was not even the suddenness of the shock or the sense of void that threw Adams into the depths of Hamlet's Shakespearean silence in the full flare of Paris frivolity, in its favorite haunt, where worldly vanity reached its most futile climax in human history. It was only the quiet summons to follow, the assent to dismissal. It was time to go. The three friends had begun life together, and the last of the three had no motive, no attraction, to carry it on after the others had gone. Education had ended for all three, and only beyond some remoter horizon could its values be fixed or renewed. Perhaps some day, say 1938, their centenary, they might be allowed to return together for a holiday, to see the mistakes of their own lives made clear in the light of the mistakes of their successors. And perhaps then, for the first time since man began his education among the carnivores, they would find a world that sensitive and timid natures could regard without a shudder. End of Chapter 35, and End of the Education of Henry Adams, by Henry Adams.